Yo, what's up everyone? It's Fanfic Empire, and today we're checking out, what if Gringotts published full magical scan of Harry in Daily Prophet and entire Wizengamot arrested Dumbledore live. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1, The Scan. The letter arrived at number 4, Privet Drive at exactly 7:14 in the morning, which was unusual for two reasons. First, it was delivered not by owl but by a large, steel-grey raven with eyes like polished coins, wearing a tiny leather satchel stamped with the Gringotts crest, a mountain of gold above the words Fortius quo Fidelius. More faithful than strong. The raven landed on the kitchen windowsill with the authority of something that had never once worried about being shooed away, and it hadn't worried correctly, because when Vernon Dursley raised his rolled-up newspaper at it, the bird fixed him with a look so ancient and contemptuous that Vernon sat back down without quite knowing why. Second, it was Harry Potter's 11th birthday, and no one at number 4, Privet Drive had ever delivered him a letter in his life. Harry was in the cupboard under the stairs, which was technically still his bedroom for another 6 days. Aunt Petunia had promised him Dudley's second bedroom once Dudley had cleared enough broken toys out of it, a promise she made with the same tone she used for most promises to Harry, which was the tone of someone describing events in a foreign country they didn't expect to ever visit. He was lying on his thin mattress reading a library book about the history of the London Underground because it was the only book he'd been allowed to bring home that week, and listening to the house wake up around him. Dudley thundering down the stairs. Uncle Vernon demanding his bacon not crispy. Aunt Petunia's low, efficient movements in the kitchen. The raven's arrival changed the temperature of the whole morning. Harry heard the commotion, Vernon's strangled noise, Petunia's sharp intake of breath, a pause so complete it pressed through the cupboard door, and then Petunia's voice, very controlled, "Vernon. Don't touch it." "I'm not going to touch it, Petunia, I'm going to, don't." Another pause. Then the sound of the satchel clasp opening by itself. Harry had the cupboard door open before he'd consciously decided to move. The raven was still on the windowsill. The satchel had deposited a thick cream envelope onto the kitchen table, and it was sitting there now among the breakfast things with a kind of patient enormity, like a stone dropped into still water. The envelope had no address on it. Instead, the front was stamped, deeply, as though pressed by something very heavy, with the Gringotts mountain crest, and below it, in dark ink that shimmered faintly copper in the morning light, Harrison James Potter, urgent estate matter, by order of Chieftain Ragnok. Vernon had gone the specific shade of red he went when things were happening that he couldn't control or explain. Petunia was very still in the way she went still sometimes when anything to do with magic entered the house, not frightened exactly, more like a woman bracing for weather. Dudley, still in his pajamas, was staring at the raven. "Is that a crow?" "Dudley, go upstairs," Petunia said. "But, now." Dudley went. Harry stepped fully into the kitchen. The raven turned its coin-bright eyes on him and made a sound in its throat, not quite a caw, more like the sound of a vault door settling into its frame, and then it opened its wings and was gone, straight through the closed window, which rippled like water and was solid again an instant later. "That's mine," Harry said, nodding at the envelope. "You don't know that," Vernon said. "It has my name on it." Vernon looked at the envelope. He looked at Harry. Something moved behind his eyes, the calculation Harry had learned to recognize, the weighing of what he could get away with, and then he looked at the Gringotts crest, and the calculation came up different than usual. "Fine," he said, as though granting an enormous favor. "Fine. Take it. Take it and go to your cupboard." Harry took it and went to the kitchen table instead, sat down in Dudley's chair, and opened it. 3 inches of parchment fell out, dense with text and figures, and a separate card, cream, heavy, embossed, which read, "Mr. Potter, you are requested to present yourself at Gringotts Bank, Diagon Alley, at your earliest convenience, but no later than the 28th of July. The matter is of urgent financial and legal significance to your estate. A guide will be provided if transportation is required. Please bring this letter as identification." This request supersedes all previous arrangements made on behalf of your estate by any third party. By order of Chieftain Ragnok, Gringotts Bank, London. The parchment underneath was different, older looking, though it couldn't have been more than a day old. It was covered in dense columns of figures and symbols Harry didn't recognize, but at the top, in plain English, the heading read, Inheritance and Magical Estate Scan, Harrison James Potter, conducted July 31, 1991, Gringotts Bank, London. Harry stared at it for a long time. He didn't understand most of it. He understood enough. His name was on it. His real name, Harrison, not Harry, which nobody had ever called him. There was a section headed Titles and Lordships that had 6 entries, and next to 4 of them was a notation he couldn't read. There was a section headed Magical Core Assessment, and next to it, in the column marked Current Status, were 3 words that were plain enough: suppressed. See notation 7. And at the very bottom, in ink darker than the rest, a single line: unauthorized external bindings detected, 3 instances: nature, loyalty compulsion, perception alteration, core restriction, placed by, notation 12, date placed, January 11, 1981, November 1981. He'd have been 15 months old. Harry sat very still. The breakfast smells, bacon, toast, the burnt edge of Aunt Petunia's tea, went on around him as though nothing at all had happened. Outside, a car started in the street. A dog barked twice and stopped. "What does it say?" Petunia asked. Her voice had a quality he'd rarely heard in it, something stripped of its usual sharpness, raw underneath. He looked at her. She was standing by the sink with her arms crossed, looking at the parchment in his hands rather than at his face, and she looked, for just a moment, like someone who already knew the answer and was hoping she was wrong. "It says I need to go to the bank," Harry said. He folded the parchment back into the envelope. He held it against his chest. "I need you to take me to London." Back in Gringotts, back before the letter arrived, back at the precise moment it all began, the story was already running fast. Gringotts Bank operated on a calendar that bore little resemblance to the wizarding world above it. The goblins maintained their own feast days, their own fiscal year, their own legal cycles, and it was one of these legal cycles, specifically, the decennial estate verification, a 10-year audit of all accounts held in trust for minor witches and wizards, that had caught the Potter account the night before Harry's 11th birthday and done something the account managers had assumed could never happen. It had thrown an error. Not a small error. Not a discrepancy in galleon count or a missing property deed. The kind of error that made the audit matrix lock up entirely, cascade through 3 separate subsystems, and summon a notification that went, bypassing every level of middle management, directly to the desk of Chieftain Ragnok himself. Ragnok had been chieftain for 47 years. He had seen human political drama, goblin rebellion, 2 wizarding wars, and the full spectrum of wizard financial malfeasance, and he read the alert on his desk at 2 in the morning with the focused stillness of someone who understood immediately that what he was holding was not a problem. It was leverage. He summoned his senior estate manager, a goblin named Ragnok who was 312 years old and had forgotten more about magical inheritance law than most wizards had ever known, and by 3 in the morning they had the full Gringotts scan running on the Potter account. The scan took 4 hours. When it finished, the output was 63 pages long. Ragnok read all 63 pages. He read them twice. Then he sat back in his chair, folded his long fingers together, and looked at Ragnok across the desk. "Well," he said. "Yes," Ragnok said. "The transparency clause. Paragraph 47 of the 1689 Goblin Banking Accord," Ragnok confirmed. "Any scan result indicating unauthorized external manipulation of a client account, conducted under the decennial verification protocol, must be disclosed to all relevant parties and published through appropriate channels within 24 hours of completion." "It's not," he paused, and the pause held something that in a human might have been amusement. "It's not optional." "No," Ragnok said. "It isn't." He looked at the stack of parchment on his desk. 63 pages. 3 unauthorized magical bindings on an 11-year-old child. 4 suppressed lordships. 1 missing will, James Potter's secondary will, the one that had apparently been filed with the Wizengamot and then vanished from the record entirely. Sirius Black named as magical guardian with no record of that guardianship ever being activated or legally contested. And underneath it all, threaded through the account history like a wire through a wall, the signature of one Albus Dumbledore. Ragnok was not, in the human sense of the word, a moral creature. He believed in contracts, in debts, in the weight of obligation. He did not particularly care about Harry Potter's suffering. What he cared about was that someone had used a Gringotts-held account as the vehicle for sustained financial and magical fraud, had redirected trust fund disbursements for 10 years, had suppressed lordship titles that came with seats on the Wizengamot's governing board, and had done all of this while presumably maintaining that Harry Potter was well cared for and the estate was in order. That was a violation of the Gringotts Charter. That was, by goblin law, an act of war. He pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward him. Get me the Daily Prophet's emergency disclosure contact. Get me Witch Weekly, the Quibbler, and the ICW's public registry. And get me an owl to the boy's listed address. He paused. No. A raven. The Potters always rated a raven. Ragnok was already moving toward the door. The press disclosure, do we include the full 63 pages, or, we include everything, Ragnok said, and his voice was very even and very final. Every word. Every figure. Every notation. Paragraph 47 does not make allowances for discretion. Ragnok smiled, which was an unsettling thing on a goblin face. No, he said. It doesn't. At 6 a.m, the Daily Prophet's presses were already running. They ran every morning, it was an automated process, the rollers locked in at 5:30 and the owls loaded by 6:15, and in the normal way of things the editorial team had nothing to do until 9 o'clock in the afternoon edition planning meeting. The Gringotts disclosure arrived at 5:47. Barnabas Cuff, editor-in-chief of the Daily Prophet, was not usually in the building at 5:47 in the morning. He was in the building this particular morning because his deputy editor had sent him a Patronus at 5:30, a small harried badger that barely kept its shape, carrying one sentence, Gringotts just sent us something and I don't know what to do with it. What they'd sent was 63 pages, a sealed legal mandate citing paragraph 47 of the 1689 Goblin Banking Accord, and a covering letter on Gringotts' letterhead that read, in its entirety, this material is submitted for mandatory public disclosure under standing Goblin banking law. Publication is legally required within the terms of the Accord. Non-publication will be treated as a breach of the Accord and will result in the immediate suspension of all Daily Prophet accounts held at Gringotts Bank, as well as a formal complaint to the British Wizarding Press Regulation Board. The enclosed documents are accurate, verified, and sealed by Chieftain Ragnok. We are also submitting identical packages to Witch Weekly, the Quibbler, and the ICW Public Registry. We trust this requires no further clarification. Cuff read it standing in the middle of the newsroom in his street clothes with his coffee going cold in his hand. Then he read the first 10 pages of the scan results, and then he put his coffee down, and then he said, to no one in particular, somebody go wake Rita Skeeter up. It's before 6, his deputy said. Go wake her up, Cuff said. Tell her it's the biggest story she'll ever write. He looked at the front page that was already queued in the press, some piece about the Chudley cannons and a contract dispute, and he looked at the 63 pages on his desk, and he made the decision that editors sometimes have to make, the kind that determines the entire shape of their career in a single moment. Stop the press, he said. Reset the front page. We're going to need a bigger headline. At Hogwarts, in the headmaster's office, Albus Dumbledore woke at 6 a.m. with the feeling that something had gone wrong. This was unusual. Albus Dumbledore was not a man who was often surprised, and he was not a man who woke with nameless dread. He was, on the contrary, almost insufferably serene in his morning routine. He had been rising at 6 for 60 years, taking tea with his phoenix fox, reading the Prophet when it arrived, and conducting his correspondence before breakfast. It was one of the great comforts of his day. Fawkes was agitated. The phoenix was moving on his perch, not the slow, majestic shifting of a content magical creature, but rapid side-to-side steps, his flame-colored feathers ruffled, his golden eyes fixed on Dumbledore with an expression that might have been accusatory in a human face. "Old friend," Dumbledore said softly, and Fawkes made a sound that was nothing like his usual music. It was a single, low, discordant note, like a cello string struck wrong, and it hung in the air for a moment before dissolving. Dumbledore sat up in his chair and reached for his tea, and the Prophet arrived at that exact moment, dropped through the window by a school owl, and landed on his desk with a sound that seemed louder than it should have. He looked at the front page. The headline was in type so large it covered a third of the page. Gringotts drops a bomb, full magical estate scan of Harry Potter published under banking law, unauthorized bindings, suppressed lordships, stolen inheritance, and a name Wizarding Britain will recognize, SEE pages 1 to 17 below it, Rita Skeeter's byline. Below that, a photograph of Harry Potter, the same school photograph from some Muggle institution that the Prophet had run twice before, the one that showed a small boy with too large glasses and hair that didn't lie flat, reproduced enormous, next to the Gringotts crest. And below that, taking up the bottom quarter of the front page, the first section of the scan results. Dense columns of figures. Titles and lordships. The 3 words that Harry had read in his kitchen an hour later, suppressed. See notation 7. And the name, spelled out fully in notation 12, which Rita Skeeter had helpfully reproduced in a separate call-out box with a border of black ink, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Order of Merlin First Class, Headmaster, Hogwarts School, Chief Warlock, Wizengamot. Dumbledore set his teacup down. He looked at the paper for a very long time. Outside the windows, the dawn was coming up over the Scottish mountains, painting the lake pink and gold. Fawkes had gone quiet on his perch, watching him. The portraits of former headmasters, usually beginning to stir at this hour, calling cheerful good mornings to each other, were all awake and silent. "Albus," said the portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black, in a tone that combined satisfaction and wariness in roughly equal measure. "I'd say good morning, but—" Dumbledore said nothing. He picked up the paper again and turned to page 3, where the scan results were reproduced in full. He read them carefully. He was looking, with the methodical precision of someone who had been playing chess at this level for decades, for what he could still control, what he could still explain, and what was, for the first time in a very long time, simply, irretrievably, out of his hands. His expression didn't change. His hands were perfectly steady. But when Fawkes let out another low, wrong note, Dumbledore closed his eyes for just a moment, and in that moment something moved across his face that wasn't serenity, wasn't strategy, wasn't the ancient patience he wore as naturally as his robes. It was something much older and much worse. It was the face of a man who had known, somewhere very deep, that this day was always going to come. At number 4, Privet Drive, getting Aunt Petunia to drive him to London took approximately 45 minutes of negotiation, during which Vernon twice said he absolutely forbade it. Dudley asked 3 times if Harry was going to get money, and Harry discovered something new about his aunt. She was scared. Not of him, he was used to that kind of fear, the disgusted recoil, the overbright cleaning after he touched things. This was different. She was scared for him, in the oblique, locked-away way she was scared for most things she refused to acknowledge caring about, and it came out sideways in how hard she gripped the steering wheel and how she didn't once tell him to stop fidgeting even though he couldn't stop turning the Gringotts letter over in his hands. "How do you even know where it is?" she asked, when they'd made it onto the M25 and the argument was technically over. "The letter has an address," Harry said. She made a sound that meant of course it does. They didn't speak again for 20 minutes. Then Petunia said, to the windscreen, "What did the rest of it say?" "The longer paper." Harry hesitated. "I'm not sure I understood all of it. But, someone put something on me." Magically. When I was a baby. Silence. 3 somethings, he said. More silence. Then, I know. The word landed in the car like a dropped stone, and Harry turned to look at her fully for the first time since they'd left the house. She was staring at the road. Her jaw was very tight. He stopped. Started again. You know? Not specifics. She swallowed. I knew something had been done. When they left you on the doorstep. There was a letter, Dumbledore left a letter with you. Her voice had gone flat and careful, the way it went when she was trying not to feel whatever she was feeling. It said you were safe. It said the blood protection your mother had died for would keep you safe as long as you could call my home your home. It said, she stopped. What did it say? Harry asked quietly. It said that it was necessary. That certain arrangements had been made to ensure the best possible outcome for everyone. She pressed her lips together. I burned it. I should have kept it. But I was so angry, and he spoke like everything was already decided. Like none of us had any say. Harry turned back to the front. Outside, the motorway unreeled in both directions, the ordinary grey world going about its ordinary business, entirely ignorant of 63 pages of goblin audit that were currently sitting in a printing press somewhere. He does that, Harry said, without quite knowing where the words came from, because he'd never met Albus Dumbledore in his life. Doesn't he? Petunia didn't answer. But her knuckles went white on the wheel. Diagon Alley in the early morning was different from how it would later be described to Harry, the hustle and color and noise of 100 magical shops, because they arrived at 8:15 in the morning and found it already in chaos. Not the usual market day kind. The kind where people are standing outside shops in groups, holding newspapers, talking over each other, and everyone has the same slightly electrified expression, the one that means did you see this, did you read this, what does it mean? Harry and Petunia came through the leaky cauldron. Harry had found the entrance in a travel book from the library, and Petunia had walked past it once already before Harry had grabbed her arm, and into the alley, and the first thing Harry heard was his own name. Not in the way he was used to, the quiet pointing and whispering that he vaguely knew happened because of the scar. Louder. Multiple voices. The Potter scan, did you read what it said about, a woman in emerald green robes was crying, actually crying, with her friend's hand on her arm. An old wizard with a silver beard was reading the paper with his hands shaking slightly. 2 younger men in aura robes were standing aside from the crowd, speaking in low voices, and one of them kept looking at the paper and then away, like it was too bright to look at directly. Petunia put her hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, the most physical contact she had initiated in years, and then removed it so quickly she might have imagined it. Go, she said. I'll wait in that tea shop. Don't be too long. Harry looked at the crowd, at the copies of the Daily Prophet that seemed to be in every other person's hands, and said, something's happened. Yes, Petunia said, in a voice that had gone very small. I rather think it has. Inside Gringotts, the marble halls were busy with a specific kind of busy, controlled, rapid, purposeful, that looked nothing like the usual dignified shuffling of vault transactions and currency exchanges. Goblins were moving with unusual speed. There were 3 times the normal number of them at the teller's counters, and behind the main floor, in the corridors Harry could just see through the arched doorways, more were moving with scrolls and cases and an air of preparing for something. He approached the nearest teller, a goblin with iron-gray hair who looked at him with the beady-eyed assessment of someone who has been recognizing famous people all morning and is entirely unimpressed by the fact. I'm Harry Potter, Harry said. I have a letter. It says I should. We know who you are, the goblin said, not unkindly exactly, but with the flat efficiency of someone who has better things to do. We've been expecting you. Early, though. He looked at Harry with what might have been approval. Good. Follow the escort. 2 other goblins appeared at Harry's flanks with no preamble whatsoever. He hadn't seen them approach, and they were walking before he'd quite decided to walk, deeper into the bank, through one of the arched corridors, down a passage lit by torches that burned blue, white and cold, and up to a door that was carved with the Gringotts mountain crest at 4 times normal size. One of the escort goblins knocked twice. A voice said, "Enter." The office was large by goblin standards, which meant it was approximately the size of a normal human office. It was lined floor to ceiling with shelves of ledgers and scrolls, and in the middle of it was a desk the size of a dining table, behind which sat the most senior-looking goblin Harry had ever seen, though he had never seen any, not officially, not like this. This goblin was old in a way that had weight to it, like stone is old. He had a face like a map of somewhere that had seen a great deal of weather, and eyes the color of old gold, and he looked at Harry for a long moment before speaking. "Sit down, Mr. Potter," said Chieftain Ragnok. "We have a great deal to discuss." Harry sat. One of the escort goblins placed a cup of something on the desk, dark, slightly smoking, smelling of copper and something herbal, and withdrew. "Do you know why you're here?" Ragnok asked. "The scan," Harry said. The letter mentioned an estate scan. And the paper mentioned it too. I saw people reading the paper outside and," he stopped. "It's in the paper, isn't it?" "The whole thing." "The whole thing," Ragnok confirmed, without apology or softening. "Our legal obligations under the 1689 Accord are unambiguous. When a verification scan reveals unauthorized manipulation of a client's magical estate, the results must be made public. We sent the disclosure package to 5 publications at 6 this morning. The Daily Prophet ran a special edition at 7. I expect the afternoon edition will be somewhat," he paused, "livelier." Harry absorbed this. "So everyone knows." "Every witch and wizard who reads a morning paper," Ragnok said. "Which is, in Britain, most of them." Harry looked at the desk. At the stack of paper on it, 63 pages, he now understood. "What does it actually mean?" he said. "The scan." "I understood some of it, but, the bindings, and the lordships, I will explain everything," Ragnok said. "That is why you're here. But first," he leaned forward slightly, and his old gold eyes were very direct. "I want to ask you something, Mr. Potter, before we go through the details. Before you hear all of it." "Okay," Harry said. "How do you feel this morning? Before you came here?" It was such an unexpected question that Harry answered honestly, without thinking. "Angry," he said. "I feel angry. And like things are happening to me again and I still don't know what they are. Like everyone else already knows the shape of something and I'm just," he stopped. "Just the last to know," Ragnok said. "Yeah." Ragnok nodded slowly, as though this was an answer that satisfied something. "Then let me make this very clear to you," he said. "You are not the last to know anything anymore. Not in this bank. Everything we have, every piece of information in those 63 pages, is yours. You are not a ward, not an instrument, not a symbol. You are a client of Gringotts Bank, and what has been done to your estate, to your person, is a violation that this institution takes seriously. Do you understand?" Harry looked at him. He didn't entirely trust the seriousness. He'd been on the receiving end of too many people claiming to have his best interests in mind to simply accept it at face value, but there was something in the goblin's directness, the total absence of warmth that paradoxically made the honesty feel cleaner, that he found he could work with. "I understand," Harry said. "Tell me what they did." So Ragnok told him. He talked for 40 minutes. Ragnok was also present, bringing supplementary pages when referenced, and Harry sat across the vast desk and listened with the focused, slightly nauseated concentration of someone receiving a diagnosis they didn't know they'd been waiting for. The 4 suppressed lordships first, Potter, Black, Peveril, and Gryffindor, all of them inheritable through different bloodlines and all of them suppressed by a single magical binding that had been placed on Harry's name in the wizarding registry, meaning he had never been automatically elevated to those titles on his parents' deaths the way he should have been. Each of those lordships carried a seat on the Wizengamot. Combined, they gave Harry a voting bloc that would have shifted the balance of the governing body significantly, particularly in the immediate post-war period when Dumbledore had pushed through a number of legislative measures by relatively narrow margins. The missing will came next, James Potter's secondary will, filed by solicitor and subsequently removed from the Wizengamot's registry, which named Sirius Black and Remus Lupin as co-guardians, specified that Harry was under no circumstances to be placed with Petunia Desley without consent from both named guardians and a full Wizengamot hearing, and contained explicit instructions about the management of Harry's trusts and the suppression of none of his inheritance. The will hadn't been destroyed. It had been misfiled, which was to say, it had been moved, deliberately, to a category of archived documents that were automatically sealed for 25 years under an obscure Wizengamot storage protocol. Not destroyed. Buried. Then the bindings. 3 of them, placed on a 15-month-old child on the 1st of November, 1981, the morning after the events at Godric's Hollow. The first was a core restriction, a binding on Harry's magical core that reduced its available output to roughly 60% of its natural capacity. Not enough to prevent him from functioning as a wizard. Enough to ensure he never operated at his full potential, never came into his inheritance magically, never became, in the language of Notation 7, which Ragnok read aloud with flat precision, a focal point of magical power sufficient to act as an independent political force. The second was a perception alteration, a subtle, continuous charm that affected how people perceived Harry. Not memory modification, not a glamour, but a gentle constant pressure on the impressions of those around him, designed to nudge his presentation towards something smaller, less significant, less worthy of serious attention. The kind of magic, Ragnok explained, that didn't make people not notice Harry, but made them notice him as a symbol rather than a person. A boy who lived rather than a boy who was living. The third was a loyalty compulsion, and this was the one that made Harry go very quiet when Ragnok described it. A compulsion placed not on Harry but on specific individuals, key figures in his life, designed to make them feel a baseline of loyalty and trust toward Dumbledore that exceeded what they would naturally feel. It was broad spectrum rather than individual, it worked on proximity, activated by interaction with certain objects, and had been maintained and renewed periodically over the past decade. Hagrid, Harry said. Yes, Ragnok said. And the Weasley family. The whole, they're on the list. Yes. Harry looked at the page Ragnok had placed in front of him. 12 names. 12 people who had been, for the past 10 years, interacting with Harry's world with an extra layer of manufactured feeling. He didn't know most of the names. He knew 3 of them. Hagrid. And 2 names he recognized from letters and conversations, Arthur Weasley, Molly Weasley. Does it mean, he had to stop and start again? Does it mean their feelings aren't real? If I meet them and they like me, it won't be, the compulsion affects their relationship with Dumbledore, Ragnok said, more gently than Harry expected. Not with you. It makes them more likely to trust Dumbledore's judgment, including his judgment about you. It does not manufacture feelings for you specifically. But it affects whether they trust the whole situation, Harry said. Whether they question it. Ragnok was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. It does. Harry nodded. He looked at the paper in front of him. He looked at the name at the bottom, the one in darker ink, and felt the anger he described to Ragnok not burning but settling, going solid, the way water becomes ice. The bindings, he said. Can they be removed? The core restriction, yes, we have ritual specialists on staff, and the process is straightforward if the client consents and the magic isn't too old. Ragnok paused. Yours is 10 years old, but it was not designed to be permanent. It will take a ritual session of approximately 3 hours. The perception alteration? More complex. But yes. It will take longer to fully dissipate from the environment. It has spread, been reinforced by ambient magic over the years. But removing the source binding will begin the process. The loyalty compulsion? That is already, as of this morning, in legal jeopardy. Ragnok's tone was the kind of even that contained something like satisfaction underneath it. The publication of the scan results constitutes legal evidence of unauthorized magic. The Wizengamot will be, I anticipate, convening an emergency session within 48 hours. Once that session is convened, the compulsions cannot be legally renewed or maintained without the individuals being informed. For most of those on the list, being informed will be sufficient to begin the natural dissolution of the binding. Harry thought about that. About 12 people waking up, reading a newspaper, and slowly feeling something they believe to be their own feeling, something warm and trustful and loyal, start to feel a little different. A little less self-evidently true. What about Dumbledore? Harry asked. Ragnok looked at him steadily. That, he said, is a question for the Wizengamot. Harry left the meeting with a Gringotts account key, a stack of documents he was told to keep safely, an appointment the following week for the core restriction ritual, and something he didn't quite have a word for yet. It was in his chest, not quite lightness, not quite fear. Something more like the moment just before a very large door swings open. He walked back through the marble hall. The bank was even busier now. There were wizards at every counter, many of them holding copies of the Daily Prophet, several of them in what appeared to be animated conversation with their account managers. 2 witches near the entrance were crying openly. An old man in auror blue was standing aside with a piece of parchment and an expression of concentrated fury. Outside, on the steps of Gringotts, the alley had gotten louder. There were more people now. It was after 9, the shops were opening, and the hum of voices had the quality of something building. Not violent. Not yet anything that definite. But the kind of collective energy that happens when a large number of people simultaneously revise a belief they'd held comfortably for a very long time. Harry stood at the top of the steps and looked at it. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman was reading the paper aloud to a group of people who were listening with their mouths open. The word Dumbledore came out of the crowd every few seconds like a stone breaking the surface of water. He thought about Ragnok saying you are not the last to know anything anymore, and he thought about the 3 bindings, and the missing will, and 12 names on a list, and a letter that his aunt had burned 10 years ago. He thought, with a clarity that surprised him by its force, I am 11 years old and I have been managed since I was 15 months old and I am absolutely furious and I don't know yet what to do with that, but I am going to figure it out. He walked down the steps into the alley. Behind him, the raven from that morning was sitting on the stone lintel above the bank doors, watching him go with its coin-bright eyes, and it made a sound that was very much like approval. Chapter 2, The morning the world changed. Amelia Bones read the Daily Prophet the way she read everything, standing up, at her kitchen counter, with her coffee going cold beside her because she always forgot about it when she was reading. She was a compact, precise woman in her early 50s with a monocle she only wore when she wanted people to know she was paying very close attention, and she was paying very close attention now. She read the front page. She turned to pages 2 through 17 without pausing. She read every column of the scan results, cross-referencing Rita Skeeter's annotations, and she was grudgingly grateful for them, because Skeeter, whatever her other considerable failings, knew how to translate goblin legal formatting into plain English without losing the substance, and when she finished she set the paper down on her counter and stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up her wand, cast a Patronus, it burst out as a large, no-nonsense badger, and sent it with 3 words to 3 different people simultaneously: emergency. My office. She was at the Ministry of Magic by 7:45. Her deputy, a steady man named Savage who had the gift of appearing wherever he was needed without being summoned, was already there with 2 copies of the Prophet and a pot of coffee that was actually hot. Morning, ma'am. Sit down, Savage. She hung her traveling cloak on the rack behind the door and was already pulling files before she'd turned around. What have we got? Overnight traffic's been quiet, the disclosure didn't hit the street editions until 7, so the public reaction is only just starting. But the overnight owls, he pushed a stack of correspondence toward her. 42 from private citizens, 12 from sitting Wizengamot members, 3 from the ICW liaison office, and 1 from Gringotts directly. She picked up the Gringotts letter first. Read it in 15 seconds. Set it down. They've sent their own counsel to the Wizengamot registry. Filing a formal complaint. Under the terms of the 1689 Accord, yes. They're entitled to. She sat down and pulled the stack of Wizengamot letters toward her. 12 members, 12 different tones, but all of them circling the same word, session. Emergency session. Extraordinary session. Immediate session. The language varied, the urgency was uniform. Who've we got in opposition to convening? Savage hesitated. So far? Nobody, ma'am. She looked up at him. I know, he said. That's the thing, isn't it? She thought about that for a moment. In 12 years as head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, she had never once seen all 12 early morning Wizengamot correspondents pointing in the same direction. The Wizengamot was a body that disagreed on the color of the sky as a matter of professional habit. The fact that 12 of its members, representing wildly different political factions, had all written to her before 8 in the morning requesting the same thing meant one of two things: either the situation was genuinely incontrovertible, or someone was organizing very quickly. Possibly both. I want the full Wizengamot convened by noon, she said. She checked her watch. 4 hours. Can we get quorum? If I start making calls in the next 10 minutes, yes. Start making calls. She stood. And get me the Potter file. Everything we have: birth record, Godric's Hollow incident report, the guardianship determination from 81. All of it. Savage was at the door. He stopped. The guardianship determination, he said. Are you sure? That file was processed under whose authority? He was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore. He appeared before the emergency Wizengamot session on November 2, 1981, and gave testimony about the appropriate placement for the Potter child. It was a small session, only 9 members. The determination was made in, he checked a notation on his clipboard. 11 minutes. Amelia looked at him steadily. 11 minutes, she said. Yes, ma'am. To determine the guardianship of the wizarding world's most famous orphan. Yes. Get me the file, she said, and her voice had gone to the particular register she used when she was very angry and working very hard not to sound it. Get me everything. The Daily Prophet second edition hit the streets at 10, and if the first edition had been a stone dropped in still water, the second was a boulder. Skeeter had had 3 more hours and she had used them with the focused ferocity of someone who understood that this was the story of her career and possibly the story of the century, and the second edition went deeper, into the missing will, into the suppressed lordships and what they would have meant for the Wizengamot voting record, into the careful, documented history of every major legislative decision that had passed by narrow margins in the post-war period while Harry Potter sat in a cupboard in Surrey with 4 suppressed titles and a restricted magical core. The central column of page 1 was a list. Skeeter had titled it What Changed because Harry Potter didn't have his vote, and it was 12 items long, and it included the Dementor Employment Act, the Blood Status Registry Amendment of 1985, and the controversial Hogwarts funding reallocation that had defunded 3 student support programs in 87. Each item had the voting record beside it. Each item showed the margin. Each item, Skeeter noted, would have gone differently if 4 additional Wizengamot seats had been occupied by their rightful holder. She didn't say Dumbledore had voted for all of them. She didn't have to. The numbers did that work. The third page carried the scan's full details on the magical bindings, the core restriction, the perception alteration, the loyalty compulsion and its list of 12 names, and it was this page that caused the specific, terrible kind of quiet that falls over a crowd when something moves from abstract outrage to personal. Because the 12 names were right there on page 3, and 12 families across Britain were reading them, and the question that was rising in living rooms and kitchen tables and shop fronts across the country was not abstract at all. It was, did I choose that? The way I feel about Dumbledore, did I choose that? Some people put the paper down and went about their day and decided not to think about it. Some people sat very still and thought about it for a long time. Some people, and these were the ones who would matter later, immediately owed their solicitors. The Wizengamot's main chamber occupied the 9th floor of the Ministry of Magic, and it was designed, in the way that official spaces are sometimes designed, to impress people with its own importance. Dark wood rising to a vaulted ceiling. The central well where witnesses stood, enclosed by tiered seating on 3 sides. The Chief Warlock's elevated chair at the north end, slightly higher than everything else, with the Wizengamot seal carved into the back of it. At 11:58 in the morning, the chamber was full. Not just the 50 official members, all present, or nearly, which was itself unprecedented, but the gallery above, which held about 100 seats and was usually occupied by board ministry junior staff and the occasional journalist. Today it was standing room, and the 2 security wizards at the gallery entrance had given up on the ticketing protocol 20 minutes ago and were simply trying to ensure people didn't fall over each other. Rita Skeeter was in the front row of the gallery with her acid green quick quotes quill already active and a smile that might have concerned anyone who saw it. Amelia Bones entered the chamber from the floor-level entrance at 1 minute past noon, and the noise of the assembled Wizengamot, which had been considerable, dropped by about 2/3. She walked to the prosecutor's table, set down her case, looked at the room, and then looked at the Chief Warlock's chair at the north end, which was empty. There was a very specific quality to the silence that produced. Dumbledore had been Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot for 22 years. His chair was a fixture of the chamber more permanent in the collective imagination than the stone walls. Its emptiness had the quality of a gap in a familiar skyline, not just the absence of a thing but the violent presence of that absence. Cornelius Fudge was seated at the minister's position, a lesser chair, to the side of the main body, reflecting the Wizengamot's constitutional separation from the ministry, but occupied today by a man who was sweating visibly and had been casting nervous looks at the empty chair since he sat down. Fudge was Minister for Magic, had been for 2 years, was not a stupid man but was not a brave one, and the prophet sitting on his knee had been read and reread to the point where the newsprint was beginning to feather at the edges. Amelia Bones took her seat. She looked at Fudge. He looked back at her with an expression of someone hoping to be told what to do. She turned away from him and addressed the chamber. "Before we convene formally," she said, and her voice, trained for exactly this kind of room, cut through the remaining noise without effort. "I want to confirm quorum." Savage? Savage, from the clerk's position at the end of the table, counted. 47 of 50 members present, ma'am. Quorum confirmed. Thank you. She looked around the room, at the 50 faces on the tiered seats, at the gallery above. This session has been convened as an emergency extraordinary session under Article 19 of the Wizengamot Charter, which permits emergency convening on production of documented evidence of a serious breach of wizarding law. The Gringotts Bank disclosure published this morning constitutes that documented evidence. She paused. "I want to address one procedural matter before we begin." She let the pause develop. Let everyone in the room become aware again of the empty chair. Albus Dumbledore, in his capacity as Chief Warlock, would normally preside over this session. Under Article 19, however, when the subject of an emergency session is a matter in which the Chief Warlock has a documented conflict of interest, the presiding authority passes to the Senior Deputy Warlock. She looked at a woman 3 seats to the right of the empty chair, Griselda Marchbanks, an elderly witch of tremendous dignity and slightly explosive white hair who had been on the Wizengamot for 50 years and was currently regarding the empty chair with an expression that combined exasperation and something grimmer underneath it. Senior Deputy Warlock Marchbanks. Do you consent to preside? Griselda Marchbanks stood. She was small, she was very old, and she stood like someone who was used to rooms paying attention. I do, she said, and moved to the Chief Warlock's chair and sat in it as though she'd been doing it for years, which in a sense, several emergency sessions during the last war, one during the one before it, she had. The chair recognizes head of the DMLE Amelia Bones, Marchbanks said, with the crisp precision of someone who intended to run a tight session. Thank you. Amelia opened her case. I am presenting 3 motions this morning, and I ask the Chamber's indulgence in hearing them in sequence before debate begins, as they are connected. She laid 3 parchment scrolls on the table. Motion 1, that the Wizengamot formally requests the presence of Albus Dumbledore to answer questions arising from the Gringotts disclosure. Motion 2, that the Wizengamot appoints an independent investigative committee, separate from both the DMLE and any existing ministry body, to examine the full details of the disclosure and produce a report within 30 days. Motion 3, she paused here, and the pause had weight. Motion 3, that pending his attendance and the production of satisfactory answers to the Chamber's questions, Albus Dumbledore's authority as Chief Warlock be suspended. This motion carries an emergency detention provision under Article 23, which I will explain in full should the Chamber proceed to that point. The noise that came from the tiered seats was not uproar. It was something quieter and more complex, a collective intake of breath, 100 individual calculations happening simultaneously, the sound of a room trying to decide what it thought. From the gallery, Skeeter's quick quotes quill was moving with the speed of something that would need its nib replaced within the hour. Fudge said, "Now see here," and then seemed to realize that nobody was looking at him and subsided. A wizard in the second tier, Marcus Greengrass, a Wizengamot member of 20 years and considerable conservative influence, stood. I would like to hear the full evidence before I vote on any motion concerning Albus Dumbledore, he said, with the careful reasonableness of someone who is genuinely uncertain and is not going to pretend otherwise. Not from the Daily Prophet. From the source. That is why motion 2 exists, Amelia said. But I believe you're also asking about the scan results themselves, their authenticity. She reached into her case and produced a document. This is a certified copy of the full scan, stamped with Chieftain Ragnok's personal seal and countersigned by 3 Gringotts senior accountants. Goblin accounts are legally unimpeachable under the 1689 Accord. The results cannot be falsified, cannot be altered after seal, and have been cross-verified by 2 independent goblin audit matrices. She set it down. This is not a Daily Prophet story. This is a Gringotts document. The Prophet simply reported it. The distinction landed visibly. The room shifted. Griselda Marchbanks said, quietly but clearly, "Let's get the man in here." The sending of a Wizengamot summons was, under normal circumstances, a formal process, a parchment delivered by official owl, an acknowledgement required within 24 hours, a scheduled appearance. These were not normal circumstances, and Amelia Bones had pulled Article 19 for a reason. Under Article 19 emergency provisions, a summons became a compulsory appearance within 2 hours of delivery. Non-appearance without documented medical excuse constituted contempt of the Chamber, carrying its own legal consequences. The summons owl, a large, official ministry bird with a red band on its left leg indicating urgency, left the ministry at 12:22. At 2:17, it returned with the summons unopened. Amelia looked at the owl. At the unopened letter on the table in front of her. She was in the Chamber anteroom, where she'd taken the 45-minute recess she'd built into the session for exactly this possibility. Savage was beside her. Marchbanks had come too, which wasn't usual, and was sitting in a chair with the quality of extreme patience that belongs to people who have waited out much larger crises than this. He refused the summons, Savage said. He returned it unopened, Amelia said. That's different. He may not have, she stopped herself. She was not going to construct excuses. Or he did, and made that choice deliberately. Either way. She looked at Marchbanks. Article 23. Marchbanks folded her hands. You're sure? He's had the morning, Amelia said. The prophet ran at 7. It is now past 2 in the afternoon. In that time, he has not sent a statement, not contacted the ministry, not appeared voluntarily, not sent a deputy. What he has done, she checked the dispatch on her desk, is dismiss his classes for the day, which suggests he is at Hogwarts and aware and choosing silence. Or he's already gone, Savage said, quietly. Everyone in the room processed that possibility. If he's gone, Amelia said, then we will find him. But Article 23 first. We do this properly. She stood. Reconvene at 2:30. I'll present the motion formally. She walked back into the chamber, and the full Wizengamot stirred to attention around her, and she thought, with the focused, cold clarity she brought to every serious case, about a list of 12 names and a child in a cupboard in 11 minutes in 1981, and she tabled motion 3 with a steadiness in her hands that she was moderately proud of. Albus Dumbledore had not, in fact, left Hogwarts. He was in his office, and he was doing something that almost no one in the wizarding world had ever seen him do. He was making contingency plans in a hurry. The chess set on the corner table had been cleared and reset 4 times since morning. The pensieve on the shelf behind his desk had been used, the surface still slightly disturbed, the faint shimmer of recently extracted memory hovering. 3 of the portraits on the walls were empty, their subjects having left to gather information from their counterparts in other institutions, as portraits could do when asked. Phineas Nigellus had come back 40 minutes ago with a report from his portrait at number 12, Grimmauld Place, that made Dumbledore stand very still for a long time. Then had gone back. Now returned again, settling into his frame with a theatrical sigh that Dumbledore did not acknowledge. They've convened, Phineas said. Full session. Marchbanks is in your chair. Dumbledore said nothing, moving a chess piece. Amelia Bones is presenting 3 motions. The third one has a detention provision. You do know what that means. He paused. Albus. I know what it means, Phineas. Then perhaps, I know what it means, Dumbledore said again, and his voice was quiet in the way that it went quiet when the conversation was over. He moved another piece. He looked at the board. He looked at it for a long time, the way he looked at things when he was calculating something, and then he moved a piece he hadn't moved in 40 years of whatever this particular game was. The king's pawn, forward. An offer of exchange. A shortening of the board. He sat back. I placed those bindings, he said, to no one in particular. The portraits were listening. Fawkes was on his perch, very still. The office held the specific silence of a very old space absorbing a very serious admission. I placed them because I believed, I still believe, that an 11-year-old child with the full weight of 4 Wizengamot lordships and an unrestricted magical core and a prophecy binding him to the Dark Lord was not safer but more endangered. Not more powerful but more targeted. That restricting his influence until he was ready was, he stopped. He was doing something he rarely did, which was searching for the word he actually meant rather than the word that sounded right. Necessary, Phineas offered, with an edge. I was going to say defensible, Dumbledore said. And then, after a silence, and I'm no longer certain it is. In 22 years as Chief Warlock, 40 years as Hogwarts headmaster, and a longer span than either as the figure around whom British wizarding society had organized its sense of safety, Albus Dumbledore had made exactly 2 public admissions of error. This was not a public one. There was nobody here who mattered in the way that counted, no one whose opinion would alter anything. But Fawkes raised his head when he said it, and made a single clear note, not the discordant wrong-string sound of the morning, but something more like the first note of a melody, and Dumbledore looked at the phoenix for a long moment. Then the Ministry Owl appeared at his window, red band on its left leg, and Dumbledore looked at it, and it was the second time this morning that something moved across his face that wasn't strategy. He opened the window. He took the summons. He set it on his desk without opening it. He sat for 11 minutes, the same 11 minutes it had taken to determine Harry Potter's guardianship in 1981, though he wasn't counting, and then he did something that surprised even the portraits. He stood up, picked up his wand, put on his traveling cloak, and walked to the fireplace. Phineas Nigellus leaned forward. "Albus. Where are you, the Ministry?" Dumbledore said. He looked at the summons on his desk. Then back at the fire. "Tell Minerva I'll be back for dinner." Tell her I said not to worry," he said, with something that might have been, that absolutely was, even if no one in this room would say so, a kind of dark humor. "She'll ignore me, but tell her anyway." He stepped into the fire. Harry didn't see the afternoon session of the Wizengamot. He was in a tea shop in Diagon Alley with his aunt, who had ordered a large pot of tea and was on her third cup and had said approximately 4 words since he'd come back from Gringotts, and those words had been "what did they say," and when Harry had said quite a lot, she had poured her second cup and looked out the window. The alley had gotten more crowded through the morning. The tea shop was full, every table occupied, the low hum of conversation threaded through constantly with the same words, the same names. Harry had his back to the room, which meant he couldn't see if anyone was looking at him, which meant he probably was because he'd noticed 3 people stop talking when he walked in. He'd put his hood up. He was working through the stack of documents Ragnok had given him, trying to understand what he was actually looking at. Some of it was straightforward: account balances, vault inventories, properties. The Potter family owned 3 properties, all currently empty and under Gringotts' protective administration: a house in Godric's Hollow, a townhouse in London, and something called Rook Cottage in Cornwall. The Black family accounts were more complicated and the Goblin annotations more dense, but the upshot appeared to be that they were substantial and that Harry stood to inherit the majority of them, conditional on. There were several conditions, all crossed with legal notation, events that hadn't resolved yet. Then there was the Gryffindor and Peverell inheritance, which was mostly title and property rather than liquid wealth, and which Ragnok had flagged with a notation that simply said discuss separately when client is prepared for it, which Harry had found slightly ominous. He was staring at a column of figures when a copy of the Daily Prophet, the second edition, he could see by the time stamp, landed on the table beside his documents. He looked up. A woman had put it there, a witch, probably his aunt's age, with steady eyes and flower on her robes, clearly from one of the bakery shops. She looked at him for a moment and then at the scar on his forehead and then back at his face, and she said, quietly, "I'm sorry." Just that. She went back to her own table. Harry looked at the paper. Looked at his name on the front page. Looked at the scan results reproduced in columns alongside Skeeter's annotations, and he felt the strangeness of it, of being the subject of a thing rather than the witness to it. Of being a story in someone else's hands. Then he turned to page 3 and read about the loyalty compulsion and the 12 names, and he felt something settle harder in his chest, and he thought, I need to understand every single piece of this before anyone else gets to make any more decisions for me. Can I keep this? He asked his aunt. She looked at the prophet. Looked away. Yes, she said. A ministry owl arrived at 11 minutes past 2, which was notable because it flew through the open door of the tea shop, startling 3 customers and upsetting a cake stand, and landed on the counter and refused to move until the proprietor accepted the roll of parchment from its leg. The proprietor unrolled it, read it, and turned to address the shop. Emergency session of the Wizengamot, she said, to the room. Convened this morning. Third motion before the chamber, she paused, and her voice went very slightly strange. Motion to suspend Chief Warlock Albus Dumbledore pending investigation. Detention provision invoked under Article 23. The shop went completely silent. Then, from somewhere at the back, a voice, older, male, the voice of someone who had been through the last war and hadn't quite recovered from it, about bloody time. And the room erupted. Amelia Bones was in the middle of presenting the legal basis for Motion 3 when the doors of the Wizengamot chamber opened. She stopped speaking. Everyone in the chamber stopped what they were doing. Albus Dumbledore walked in, alone. No escort, no assistant, none of the small ceremony that usually accompanied his presence anywhere. Just him, in his robes, not formal Wizengamot robes, just his traveling clothes, deep blue with silver thread, and his wand at his hip and his expression calm in a way that the room immediately began trying to interpret. He walked to the center of the chamber floor, the witness well, and he stopped, and he looked around the room, and then he looked at Amelia Bones, and he said, with what appeared to be perfect composure, "I understand there are questions." Marchbanks, from the chief warlock's chair, said, "There are rather a lot of them, Albus." Dumbledore looked at the chair. At her in it. Something moved very briefly in his expression and was gone. He looked back at the room. "Then ask them," he said. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then it broke apart into noise, voices from 15 different seats at once, people standing, fudge making a strangulated sound, the gallery erupting above, and through all of it, Amelia Bones stood at her table and waited, still as stone, for the room to run down. Then she said, clearly, "Did you place magical bindings on Harry Potter?" The chamber went silent. The question hung there in all that wood-paneled space, in front of 47 Wizengamot members and 100 gallery observers and Rita Skeeter's Quickquotes Quill, and Albus Dumbledore stood in the witness well and looked at Amelia Bones for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes." One word. The room detonated. But Amelia Bones, through the noise, was watching Dumbledore's face, and what she saw there was not defiance. What she saw was something that looked, in its way, like relief, the very specific, terrible relief of someone who has been waiting for a long time for the thing they've been carrying to become too heavy to hold. She picked up the detention order from her desk. It was already signed. She walked toward the witness well, and the chamber watched her go, and the noise above in the gallery was thunderous, and she thought about 12 names in 11 minutes and a boy who'd been given a cupboard. She stopped in front of Dumbledore. He was taller than her. He looked down at her, and he looked, for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, old. "Albus Dumbledore," she said, and her voice didn't shake, "I am placing you under temporary wizarding arrest pending a full Wizengamot investigation. Your chief warlock authority is hereby suspended. You will surrender your wand to the court." He reached into his robes. He produced his wand, 14 inches, elder wood, something in the air responding to its presence, a kind of pressure that eased when he placed it in her outstretched hand. He looked at her steadily throughout. "You're doing the right thing, Amelia," he said, very quietly, just for her. "I know," she said. "That doesn't make it simpler." "No," he agreed. "It wouldn't." From the gallery, the noise was indescribable. Skeeter's quill had switched to a larger nib. The Wizengamot chamber had never, in its 400-year history, seen anything quite like this afternoon, and the afternoon was not yet over. But in a tea shop in Diagon Alley, a boy with untidy hair and round glasses and a stack of goblin documents was reading page 3 of the Daily Prophet, and he wasn't watching any of it, and the world was rearranging itself around him whether he could see it or not. Chapter 3, The Weight of Chains. The morning after the arrest, Harry woke up in Dudley's second bedroom for the first time. Petunia had cleared it while he was in London, or started to, at least. Half of Dudley's broken toys were still in boxes along the wall, and the carpet had the permanent indent of a large television set that had lived there until last week. But there was a proper bed, a window that faced the back garden, and no latch on the outside of the door. Harry lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything. His mind kept returning to a specific moment from yesterday, not the scan results or the documents or Ragnok's careful, precise voice explaining what had been done to him, but the woman in the tea shop. The one with flour on her robes who had put the paper down and said "I'm sorry" and walked away. He hadn't been able to explain, even to himself, why that moment kept surfacing. Maybe because it was small. Because it hadn't asked anything of him. He got up. He pulled the stack of documents from under his mattress, old habit, hiding things, and then looked at the mattress and at his hand and put the documents on the desk instead, the way a person with a desk would do. He went downstairs. The Daily Prophet was already on the doormat, delivered by Owl at 6:30, which was new, they'd never subscribed before. Petunia must have arranged it. He picked it up. Dumbledore surrenders wand, arrested live in Wizengamot, full transcript inside below the headline, a photograph that was clearly taken from the gallery, slightly blurry, the quick quotes quill technology of magical photography doing its best with the distance, but unmistakably Albus Dumbledore standing in the witness well, unmistakably Amelia Bones walking toward him, unmistakably the wand changing hands. The photograph looped. Wand extended. Wand transferred. Dumbledore's expression in the moment, that careful composure with something genuine underneath it, reproduced over and over in the looping image. Harry sat at the kitchen table and read the whole paper without moving. It was 15 pages. Skeeter had the main story, detailed, ferocious, thoroughly sourced, with pull quotes from 7 Wizengamot members and what appeared to be a verbatim transcript of the session's key exchanges. Someone had leaked the transcript and Harry had a feeling they'd done it deliberately, because the full exchange between Amelia Bones and Dumbledore was there on page 4, word for word, including Dumbledore's answer. Yes. One word, and 15 pages to unfold what it meant. Page 6 had the loyalty compulsion list again, this time with commentary from a healing specialist in magical law named Apollinaris Whitmore, who explained in careful, measured language what long-term loyalty compulsions did to the people under them. It wasn't that they couldn't feel their own feelings, Whitmore explained. It was that there was an additional layer, a kind of atmospheric pressure on their instincts, that made certain directions of thought feel more natural than others. Trusting Dumbledore. Not questioning Dumbledore. Feeling warmth toward the world Dumbledore described. A slow, sustained pressure from the inside. The subjects will often have genuinely positive feelings toward the compulsion's target, Whitmore was quoted as saying. The compulsion works precisely because it doesn't override real emotion, it augments it. Makes it hard to distinguish what was freely felt from what was nudged. That's the insidious part. When the binding is lifted, many subjects don't feel released. They feel uncertain. They don't know what was theirs. Harry read that paragraph 3 times. He thought about the 12 names. About what it would feel like to spend years trusting someone and then be handed a piece of paper telling you the trust wasn't entirely your own, and have no way of knowing which part was which. Petunia came downstairs and saw him reading and didn't say anything, and filled the kettle, and put a cup of tea beside him without comment, and he said, "Thanks," and she said, and that was as comfortable a morning as they'd had in 11 years. The Prophet ran the Azkaban story on page 12, and Harry almost missed it because by the time he got there his tea was cold and Dudley had come down demanding breakfast and the kitchen had become its usual morning battleground. But he caught the headline, "Innocent Man? Black requests emergency hearing following disclosure," and read it in 3 concentrated minutes while Dudley's back was turned. Sirius Black had received the Daily Prophet in Azkaban at 7 in the morning, the same as everyone else. The Prophet carried a subscription service for inmates, one of those small, particular details of the wizarding prison system that existed because someone had decided that knowledge of the outside world was either a comfort or a cruelty, Harry wasn't sure which, and Sirius Black, prisoner for the past 10 years, had been reading his copy every morning with the specific devotion of someone who has very little else to do. The story said he'd started shouting at 6:45, which was technically before the paper arrived and which several guards had put down to his usual unpredictable behavior, right up to the moment he'd pressed the paper flat against the bars of his cell and demanded to speak to someone with legal authority. He'd reportedly read the loyalty compulsion section on page 3 and then sat down on his cell floor with the air of someone who had just received a diagnosis for something they'd been living with for years without a name. He was requesting an emergency hearing. Under wizarding law, any new material evidence relevant to an existing conviction entitled the convicted party to request such a hearing, and Sirius Black had named 2 pieces of new evidence: the Gringotts' confirmation that he was listed as Harry Potter's magical guardian in James Potter's secondary will, and the fact that the loyalty compulsion installed by Dumbledore had affected the testimony of at least 3 of the 7 witnesses called at his original hearing. The prophet noted, carefully, that Black had never had a trial. He'd been placed in Azkaban by emergency ministry order in November 1981, the same November, the same emergency provisions, and had remained there on the strength of witness testimony and the general belief of a traumatized wizarding public. The story didn't editorialize. It didn't need to. The sequence of events was its own editorial. Harry sat very still after he finished reading it. Dudley was saying something about eggs. The kettle was going. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower started up with its usual Sunday whine. He had a godfather. He hadn't known that. He'd known his parents were dead. He'd known the Dursleys were his only option because that had been presented to him as simply the shape of things, as immutable as physics. Not chosen. Not even decided, really. Just true, in the way that facts about his life were delivered to him, without ceremony, without explanation, always already settled before he arrived. He had a godfather who had been in Azkaban for 10 years on what was starting to look like, at minimum, very questionable legal grounds. Harry Potter had developed, over 11 years, a fairly sophisticated internal method for processing things that should devastate him. It wasn't suppression, he didn't shove things down. It was more like he looked at the thing directly, assessed its size and shape, and then filed it in the part of his mind that said this is a problem that needs solving, not a feeling that needs having right now, and got on with whatever was in front of him. He filed the Sirius Black situation. He noted it was the largest file he'd opened in some time. He kept reading. Somewhere between the dining room and the entrance hall of 12, Grimmauld Place, a portrait of a woman with a face like an architectural feature she considered her finest achievement had been hanging for 40 years and had gradually formed opinions about most of the significant events of wizarding Britain. She shared them freely and loudly, but nobody had been home in years to share them with. At 8 in the morning, on the morning after the arrest, Phineas Nigellus Black's portrait arrived back in its Grimmauld Place frame. He kept a portrait there as well as at Hogwarts, shuttling between the two as required, and settled into the painted chair with the air of someone who has witnessed a great deal and intends to be the only person in any given room who responds to it with appropriate gravity. "Well," said the architectural woman in the entrance hall portrait, as soon as he appeared. "I see you're back." "Walburga," said Phineas Nigellus. "Do try not to start." "Start? I haven't started. I've been here all morning, alone, while the entire wizarding world apparently came apart, without so much as a, Dumbledore's been arrested." Silence. The painted hallway held it. "I know," Walburga Black said, in a tone that had lost about 70% of its usual armor. "I heard it from the Diggory portrait at 6:30. I've been..." She stopped. Something moved in her painted face that was a kind of careful restraint, the expression of someone who has trained herself not to feel things visibly for so long that the training has become the face. "Sirius," she said. "The paper says, he's requested a hearing." Phineas settled back. "It's legitimate. The Gringotts disclosure gives him legal standing. Whether the Wizengamot will, they'd better," Walburga said, and there was something raw and fierce in it that no amount of painted dignity could quite contain. 10 years. My son, 10 years in that place and never even a..." She stopped herself. She composed. She became again the architectural feature. "And the boy?" she said. "Harry Potter. Safe. In his aunt's house. Visited Gringotts yesterday. His aunt's house." She said it the way she'd say his kennel, which in her world and value system was probably a distinction without a difference. He should be here. This is his house. Whatever I may think of, he should be here. That's rather a complicated legal and logistical question at the moment, Phineas said. It's not complicated at all, Walburga said flatly. His godfather is in Azkaban. His house is here. His blood is ours. She paused. Whatever Sirius made of himself, whatever he, another pause, longer. He was my son. And that boy is his family. Phineas Nigellus looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has known a person for 2 centuries and still occasionally finds them surprising. Then he went back to reading his painted newspaper, and Walburga Black went back to watching the empty hallway, and Grimmauld Place went on being dark and cold and waiting. Azkaban sat on a small island in the North Sea in the specific manner of things that are designed to be impossible to get comfortable with. The wind had a quality of intent to it, the stone had the grey of something that had been wet for centuries, and even on a clear morning the horizon looked like an argument rather than a view. Sirius Black had lived here for 10 years, and the Dementors had done their work, and what was left of him was not what anyone who had known him before would have quite recognized. He was 31 years old and looked a decade older than that, and he'd been one of the most striking people in his Hogwarts year, all pure-blood angles and dark eyes and a particular quality of physical confidence that came from never having been told no in any way that counted. That was mostly gone. The Dementors took the warmth first, then the specificity, then the fine detail, until what remained was a kind of skeleton of the person, the outline, the essential structure, but most of the color gone. But he'd gotten the paper this morning, and the paper had done something the Dementors hadn't managed. He was sitting with his back against the cell wall and the paper folded to page 3, and he had read the loyalty compulsion section so many times it was soft at the fold now. He was reading it not because he needed to, he had it essentially memorized, but because each time through, he felt something shift a fraction, like a bone that has been set wrong slowly, painfully, finding its right position. He'd spent 10 years in a cell believing himself guilty. Not of what they'd convicted him of, not of betraying James and Lily, not of killing Pettigrew and 12 Muggles, because he hadn't done those things and he knew it in the part of himself the Dementors couldn't quite reach. But guilty of something. Of choosing Pettigrew as secret keeper. Of the 12 minutes between when he'd gotten to Godric's Hollow and understood what had happened and when he'd gone after Pettigrew instead of going back for Harry. Of being the kind of person who had let himself be separated from his family at the worst possible moment. That guilt had been his. Whatever else the Dementors took, they'd left that. But this. He pressed his finger to the column of names on page 3. The loyalty compulsion list. His name wasn't on it, he'd been in Azkaban, out of range, out of contact. But the names that were on it. The 7 witnesses at his hearing, 3 of whom were on the list. 3 people whose testimony at his non-trial had been delivered under the influence of a compulsion that made them trust Dumbledore's judgment. And Dumbledore had appeared at that hearing. Had given his own testimony, briefly, precisely, in favor of the emergency incarceration order. He hadn't fabricated evidence. Sirius turned this over and over, trying to be fair, because it was important to him to be fair about this even now. Dumbledore hadn't lied. He'd simply assessed the situation, decided that Sirius Black's freedom was incompatible with Harry's safety, and nudged the people who could make that happen in the direction he wanted them to go. That was the thing about Dumbledore. He never lied. He just decided what you needed to know, and what you needed to believe, and arranged the world accordingly. Sirius had spent 10 years in a Dementor-infested cell on the strength of that man's management of a narrative. The guard came at 9, and Sirius stood up, and he looked nothing like someone who had been grinding away in a North Sea prison since he was 21. He looked, for the first time in a decade, like someone with something to do. "My hearing request," he said. The guard, a young woman who had clearly been warned about him and was doing her professional best, said, "It's been received. The Wizengamot, I want a solicitor. I'm entitled to a solicitor under Clause 7 of the Wizarding Prisoner Rights Act, and I'd like one today. She looked at her clipboard. I'll have to, I know. He kept his voice even. He'd spent years learning to keep his voice even, because anything that wasn't absolutely controlled got interpreted as proof of his instability and used to justify not listening to him. I know you'll have to check. Please check today. Because yesterday the wizarding world found out that my godson has been living in a cupboard for 10 years with 3 illegal magical bindings on him, and I would very much like to get out of this cell and go and meet him. She looked at him. Something moved in her expression, not quite sympathy, more like the expression of someone who is looking at a situation and realizing it might be simpler than the paperwork suggests. I'll put in the request, she said. He sat back down. He picked up the paper again. He turned to page 1 and looked at the photograph of Harry, school photograph, muggle, small boy with untidy hair and glasses, and felt something in his chest that the Dementors had apparently missed. Warm and jagged and complicated, the way the feelings were that you'd kept in the safest part of yourself for so long that when they got out they didn't know what temperature to be. He folded the paper and held it, and outside the Azkaban window the North Sea was the color of old iron, and he thought, James, you absolute idiot. I'm coming. I'm getting out and I'm going to get to your kid and I'm going to make this right if it's the last thing I do. It felt less like a promise and more like the first genuinely his own thing he'd thought in years. The core restriction ritual was scheduled for Thursday, but on Monday morning a letter arrived from Gringotts telling Harry that due to his legal situation, Chieftain Ragnok was requesting he return to the bank at his earliest convenience. The letter also contained, in a brief attached note from Ragnok, a list of 11 things Harry could do under his current legal authority as a Gringotts client, things that did not require Wizengamot approval, did not require Dumbledore's sign-off, and were, in the cool, precise language of goblin contract law, simply his rights as the documented heir of 4 wizarding families. He read the list twice. He underlined 3 items. Getting Petunia to take him back to London was easier the second time. She'd read the Prophet every morning since. She hadn't said much, but there was a quality to her reading of it, the careful attention, the occasional too long pause over a particular paragraph, that told Harry she was processing something large and doing it in the private way she did everything. In the car, going in, she said, "That man. Black." She kept her eyes on the road. "Your parents' friend." "My godfather," Harry said. "Yes." A pause. "I didn't know. When Dumbledore left you with me. I didn't know there was supposed to be someone else. Would it have made a difference?" Harry asked, and he kept his voice even when he said it, because it was a real question, not an accusation. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer, and then she said, "I don't know. I'd like to think," she stopped. "I was 26. Lily had just died. I was angry and frightened and this baby arrived on my doorstep and it was also," she made a sound that wasn't quite any identifiable emotion. "I don't know, Harry." He looked at the road. "That's honest, at least." She didn't say anything else, but her grip on the wheel loosened slightly, and Harry thought that was probably as close to an apology as his aunt had in her, and it was more than he'd expected, and he decided to take it for what it was. The bank was different today, less electric than Saturday's explosive morning, but busy in a way that felt purposeful and organized, the kind of busy that meant things were actually moving rather than just reacting. Harry was escorted to a different room this time, smaller, with a round table and 4 chairs, which felt more like a meeting and less like a summons. Ragnok was there. So was Ragnok. And a third goblin Harry hadn't met, older even than the others, which was saying something, with silver hair and hands that had the quality of very old maps. This one was introduced as Bonecrush, who held the title of Goblin Estate's advocate and who would, going forward, be handling the formal legal aspects of Harry's case. "Good morning, Mr. Potter," Ragnok said. "Sit down. We have several things to work through." Harry sat. He put his list of 11 items on the table. "I read the note from Mr. Ragnok. Ragnok glanced at the list. The ghost of something moved in his expression. You've marked 3. Yes. Can we start with those? Bone Crush made a sound that might have been approval. Ragnok was already pulling the relevant documents. The first item Harry had underlined was the activation of his Potter Lordship. Not all 4, the others had complications, dependencies on Sirius Black's legal situation, on the Wizengamot's ruling on the Peveril and Gryffindor lines, but the Potter Lordship was direct and clean and required only his consent and his signature and his blood on a Gringotts inheritance document. This gives me a Wizengamot seat, Harry said. It does, Ragnok confirmed. I'm 11. There is no age restriction on Wizengamot Lordship seats. There is a convention that junior members allow a proxy to speak for them until majority, but it is convention only. The seat is yours. Its absence has been incorrect. He said the word with a slight emphasis that made it sound like something much larger than its syllables. For 10 years. Harry signed the document. His blood, 1 drop on the seal, which flared briefly gold and settled. Bone Crush countersigned. Ragnok added it to a filing case. Second item, Harry said. He looked at the second underlined entry on his list. The Potter family properties. All 3 currently under Gringotts' protective wardship, Ragnok said. Vault 17 covers the maintenance costs. The townhouse in London is in the best condition, fully furnished, wards intact, self-maintaining spells active. Rook Cottage needs some work. Godric's Hollow, he paused. What? Harry asked. The main structure was partly destroyed in the events of October 31st. Gringotts has maintained the land and the foundation under the protective terms, but the house itself has not been repaired. There was some discussion, in the aftermath, of whether to preserve it as a site of significance or restore it. The discussion was never resolved because the relevant party, he stopped. Me, Harry said. You, Ragnok confirmed. The decision belongs to you. It has always belonged to you. Harry thought about that. About a house he'd never seen, that had belonged to his parents, that had been half destroyed by the man whose bindings he was still wearing. Not yet, he said. I want to deal with that separately. He moved to the third item. The London Town House. I want to know if I can use it. Ragnok looked at him with the kind of attention that is not surprised but is paying very close attention. You can use it immediately. Your keys are in Vault 17. The wards will recognize your blood. If someone were going to stay there, Harry said. Temporarily. While legal things were being sorted out. That would be, within your rights as the property owner, Ragnok said. Entirely. Harry nodded. He looked at his list. He thought about Sirius Black on the floor of an Azkaban cell with a copy of the Daily Prophet and 10 years of a wrong conviction and a request for a hearing that might take weeks. He thought about what it might mean to have somewhere for someone to go. If the hearing went right. If things moved the way they were starting to move. I want to ask you something, he said, looking up at Ragnok. The hearing request, Sirius Black's. Can Gringotts support it? Officially? Ragnok tilted his head very slightly. Explain what you mean by support. His name is on the will as my guardian. That's a Gringotts document. If Gringotts produced a formal statement confirming the existence of the will and its contents, would that carry legal weight in a Wizengamot hearing? The 3 goblins looked at each other. It was a brief exchange, less than a second, and Harry couldn't read it at all. It would carry considerable weight, Ragnok said. Goblin documents are legally unimpeachable. Would you do that? Produce the statement? Ragnok was quiet for a moment. He looked at the boy across the table, 11 years old, reading documents at 6 in the morning, asking the right questions with the focused directness of someone who has figured out that the only reliable way to move through the world is to understand it precisely and clearly, and he thought about the 1689 Accord, and the Goblin Charter, and the rather specific personal satisfaction of watching a situation that had been allowed to become very wrong start, piece by piece, to become right. "Yes," he said. "We will produce the statement." Harry let out a breath. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," Ragnok said, with the flat courtesy of a goblin who genuinely doesn't want thanks. "Pay your vault fees on time." Harry almost smiled. "Right." The ritual to remove the core restriction happened not on Thursday as scheduled but on Tuesday, because Bonecrush examined the binding on Monday afternoon and came back from it with an expression that made Ragnok rearrange the schedule. "It's accelerated," Bonecrush said. Harry was still at the table. "The binding. It was designed, I've seen this construction before, it's extremely advanced work, it was designed to tighten over time. Most core restrictions placed on young children are set at a static level. This one was keyed to grow with him." He looked at Harry across the table. "It was meant to stay ahead of your magical development. As you grew stronger, it would compress more. So it's worse than the original scan showed," Harry said. "The original scan measured current state." "Yes. The compression is at 60% now. In 2 years, when you started serious magical education," he stopped. "What?" Harry said. "You would have found magic significantly more difficult than your peers," Bonecrush said carefully. "Not impossible. You would have been competent. But your actual capacity is," he produced a figure on a piece of paper and put it in front of Harry, "considerably beyond what the restriction was leaving available." Harry looked at the figure. He didn't entirely understand the scale, but Bonecrush pointed to a comparison column that showed average, above average, and exceptional ranges, and Harry's unrestricted assessment was in a range that Bonecrush indicated with a single tap of one long finger and didn't add any comment to, because none was needed. Harry put the paper face down on the table. He thought about the binding on him, placed when he was 15 months old, tightening for 10 years, set to keep him always just a little behind his own capability, always working harder than he needed to, always a fraction less than what he should have been, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief but lived right on the border between them. "Let's do it tomorrow," he said. "Early." The ritual room was 4 levels below the main banking floor, and it smelled of copper and old stone and something sharply herbal that Harry couldn't identify. It was circular, which seemed to be a theme in goblin architecture, and the floor had markings that Ragnok had told him were 700 years old and had been used for inheritance rights and magical mediation since before the Accord. Harry lay on a stone surface that was uncomfortable in the precise, specific way that anything 700 years old is uncomfortable, and looked up at the ceiling while 2 goblin ritual specialists set up the working and Bonecrush explained what was going to happen. "You'll feel pressure first," Bonecrush said. "In your chest, your hands. Then heat. Then cold. Then probably pain, I won't lie to you about that." "How bad?" "Variable. Depending on how deeply the binding is embedded. In your case," he looked at his notes. "Bring something to hold on to." Harry thought about that. He didn't have anything. He'd come alone. Petunia had waited in the leaky cauldron, per their new arrangement, which was less a friendship than a mutual acknowledgement that they were in a complicated situation together and were getting through it by being practical about things. He hadn't thought to bring anyone. "I'll be fine," he said. Bonecrush looked at him with the expression of someone who believes you and also believes that belief doesn't change the facts. "Yes," he said. "I think you will." The ritual specialists began, and Harry stared at the ceiling, and the pressure started almost immediately, not painful at first, just a sense of something being assessed, of a foreign presence becoming aware of attention directed at it. Like a knot being found by a probing finger. Then the heat, exactly as Bonecrush had described. Then the cold, which was worse. Then the pain, which was worse still, and not in the sharp defined way of a wound but in the diffuse, nauseating way of something deep being moved. He could feel it in his chest and his hands and the back of his skull, and it was the strangest sensation, not entirely awful. Underneath the pain was something else. Something opening. Like a window in a room that had been sealed so long it had forgotten it was sealed. He didn't make a sound, because he was 11 and had spent 11 years learning not to make sounds about pain in environments where making sounds only made things worse, and that instinct held even here. He breathed. He stared at the ceiling. He thought, deliberately, about Ragnok saying you are not the last to know anything anymore, and held that thought like something solid. The ritual specialist spoke in gobbledygook throughout, low, rhythmic, unbroken. Bone Crush watched from the side with his arms folded, monitoring. 20 minutes. 40. An hour and a half. And then, crack. Not an audible crack. A felt one, deep in Harry's chest, like a frozen river in spring, like a lock whose tumblers have finally found the right alignment. Something gave way, and the pain peaked sharply and then fell away so quickly Harry gasped, not with pain but with the sudden absence of it, and the feeling that replaced it. He'd had no reference point for what his unrestricted magic felt like because he'd never experienced it. He'd thought the level of magical sense he carried around was simply normal. The ambient awareness of a person in the wizarding world. The faint hum of his own capability. It was not that. It was like the difference between hearing music through a wall and being in the room with it. Everything intensified without feeling overwhelming, a deep, clear resonance, like something that had been compressed for so long it had forgotten what its own shape was, and was remembering. He sat up slowly. His hands were shaking slightly. He held them out and looked at them. The two ritual specialists stepped back with the careful distance of professionals who have seen this before and understand the moment requires space. Bone Crush came forward and produced a small device, crystal, faceted, designed to read magical output, and held it near Harry's right hand. He looked at the reading. He looked at Harry. "How do you feel?" "Strange," Harry said honestly. "Like I'm too loud. Like the volume's been turned up and I don't." He stopped. "I need to learn to manage this, don't I?" "You will," Bone Crush said. He put the reading device away. "But yes." Harry got off the table. His legs were steady. He looked around the room, at the 700-year-old markings on the floor, at the copper smell and the cold stones and the goblin faces watching him with their opaque professional attention, and he thought about the other two bindings. The perception alteration still needing time to dissipate. The loyalty compulsion now in legal jeopardy. 2 down, in a manner of speaking. The third was the Wizengamot's problem. "Thank you," he said, "to all of them." Bone Crush gave him a short, formal nod. "Your vault has been debited. Do you need to rest?" Harry considered it. He was tired, the deep, specific tiredness of the body after something difficult. But there was also the energy of the thing that had opened, restless and new. "No," he said. "I need to eat something and then I need to go back upstairs." He looked at his hands again. He flexed them. The resonance settled slightly, not quieter, but more familiar, like a sound you've been introduced to properly and can now recognize. "I've got a lot to sort out." He found Petunia in the leaky cauldron with a cup of tea she was very clearly not tasting, and beside her, on the table, a copy of the Afternoon Prophet that she had also clearly not been reading, because she was watching the door. When he came in she looked at him with the expression she'd had in the car when she'd said "I don't know, Harry," and he realized she'd been worrying. Genuinely. Not the performed worry of someone going through motions, but the actual thing, quiet and tight around her eyes. "It's done," he said, sitting down. "Did it?" She stopped. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said. "And then, better than before, actually." She looked at him for a moment, and then looked at the table, and then looked at the prophet, and said, very quietly, "There was something about black. In this afternoon's edition. They've confirmed the emergency hearing." She paused. "For Thursday." Harry stilled. It says Gringotts submitted a formal evidentiary statement, Petunia continued. About the will. She turned the paper toward him and he saw it on page 2, brief, buried in the follow-up coverage, but clear enough. Gringotts Bank today submitted to the Wizengamot a certified evidentiary statement confirming the existence of a secondary will filed by James Potter on October 15, 1981, naming Sirius Orion Black as primary magical guardian of Harrison James Potter. The statement was submitted voluntarily and carries full legal weight under the 1689 Accord. Below it, a note that the DMLE had also requested urgent review of the 1981 guardianship hearing transcript. And below that, 3 lines that Harry had to read twice. Amelia Bones, head of the DMLE, confirmed today that the emergency incarceration order for Black, signed November 3, 1981, will be subject to full review. If the evidence before us now had been available in 1981, Bones said, the outcome would have been different. Harry put the paper down. His aunt was watching him. He's been there for 10 years, Harry said. Yes, Petunia said. While this whole thing was just. He stopped. He looked at the table. He felt the new resonance in his chest, the open window feeling, and he thought about a man sitting on a cell floor reading a newspaper and feeling something he thought was gone start to find its shape again. Does any of this make sense to you? Any of it? Petunia was quiet for a moment. My sister died, she said finally, and I spent 10 years being angry at the world she came from. And while I was doing that, a man was in prison and you were in a cupboard and 4 titles were sitting empty and apparently everyone thought that was fine. She picked up her tea. No, she said. It doesn't make sense. I think that's rather the point. Harry looked at her. She looked back at him. It was the most honest conversation they'd had in his entire life, which was a low bar, but it didn't feel like nothing. The town house, Harry said. The Potter one, in London. I want to open it up. Before Thursday. In case, he stopped. Then, Sirius Black is going to need somewhere to go. If the hearing works out. Petunia considered this. A very long consideration, during which Harry watched her work through something he couldn't quite read. Then, you'd need an adult with you, she said. To open a house. Sort out the practical things. Yes, Harry said. Another pause. I could, she pressed her lips together. I could help. With that. The practical things. She said it quickly, like something she was getting out before she thought about it too hard. Harry looked at his aunt, who had never been kind to him in any direct way, who had chosen the easier path every time the path had a fork, who had burned a letter that might have changed everything, who was sitting in a pub in the magical world she'd rejected 30 years ago drinking tea she didn't taste, and he thought, this is what people look like when they're trying. Okay, he said. Tomorrow, then. She nodded. She picked up the Prophet again, turned to page 12, and the two of them sat in the leaky cauldron reading about the hearing confirmation together in the specific, unlovely, functional way that some repairs begin, not with warmth but with proximity, not with forgiveness but with the decision to move forward toward the same thing. Outside, down the alley, voices carried. Tomorrow the Prophet would have 6 more pages. The Wizengamot would convene again. Sirius Black would meet his solicitor. Dumbledore would be somewhere in ministry custody preparing for whatever came next. And Harry Potter, 11 years old, with his magical core finally his own and 4 titles legally activated and a London townhouse to open up, sat and read the newspaper and thought about Thursday. He had the particular feeling of someone at the start of a very long piece of work who has just found the right tools. Chapter 4, The Arrest That Changed Everything. Thursday arrived the way significant days sometimes do, unremarkably. Gray sky, light rain, the smell of wet pavement and someone's breakfast from down the street. Harry was up before 6, which was not unusual. He was dressed and reading by 6:15, which was also not unusual. What was unusual was that he ate a full breakfast, proper, eggs and toast, which Petunia had made without being asked, and that when he put his coat on and picked up his documents case, Petunia was already at the door with her car keys. They didn't talk much on the way in. The radio played something about traffic on the M25 and a weather forecast that confirmed the grey sky's intentions, and Harry held his documents case on his knee and watched London assemble itself through the window and thought about nothing in particular with a focus that would have looked like calm to anyone watching. It wasn't calm. It was the thing before calm, which is more like the surface of water before it freezes, everything still moving underneath, but the movement getting slower and more organized. The Potter Town house was at the quieter end of a street in Marylebone that managed to be both entirely ordinary and slightly unreachable by people who weren't supposed to find it, which was a piece of magical architecture so subtle it took Harry 3 visits to the area before he stopped feeling like he'd taken a wrong turn. The house was 3 stories, red brick, with a dark green door and window boxes that maintained themselves with a low-level charm that had been running for 10 years on nothing but magical inertia. It smelled, inside, of old wood and something faintly herbal, like someone had been making tea a very long time ago and the memory of it had settled into the walls. Petunia had stood in the entrance hall on Wednesday afternoon with the expression of someone doing a professional assessment of structural integrity, and she had opened every window, inspected every cupboard. Harry had noticed her pause at the one under the stairs with something complicated moving in her face, and produced a list of things that needed doing, and had then done most of them herself with a thoroughness that Harry thought might be the purest form of apology she was capable of. The house was clean. The beds were made. There was food in the kitchen. Harry left a key on the entry table and hoped he'd need it back. The Wizengamot hearing for Sirius Black was listed at 10 in the morning, which meant that by 8:30 the Ministry of Magic atrium was running at the specific pitch of a place that knows it's about to be somewhere history happens. Harry had never been to the Ministry before. The cool marble of the atrium, the golden fountain in the center with its magical figures, the fireplaces along the far wall constantly flaring green with incoming arrivals, and under any other circumstances it would have been extraordinary. As it was, he walked through it in his ordinary clothes with his documents case and his new Gringotts account key and the focused bearing of someone who is here for a specific reason, and the atrium looked back at him and registered his presence the way it had been registering presences all morning, which was with a kind of collective pause and then a resumption of activity that was a fraction louder than before. He heard his name 3 times in the first 30 seconds. He kept walking. The DMLE waiting area was on the 2nd floor, and Amelia Bones was already there when he arrived. She was speaking to 2 of her people, a quiet, efficient exchange of information that she concluded without rushing when she saw Harry, and she looked at him across the corridor with the expression of someone who has been looking forward to a meeting and is reassessing the subject of it slightly. "Mr. Potter," she said, walking over. She extended her hand. "Amelia Bones." He shook it. Her grip was direct and brief. "I know who you are," he said. "Thank you for the hearing. For moving it forward." "The evidence moved it forward," she said. "I just filed the paperwork." She looked him over once with the brisk assessment of a woman who spent her professional life evaluating people rapidly. "You understand what today involves? The hearing is for Sirius Black. I'm listed as an interested party in the Gringotts documents." "Yes. Your attendance is voluntary but," she paused. "Useful. The chamber will want to know your position." "My position is that the man who is legally my guardian has been in Azkaban for 10 years without a trial," Harry said. "My position is that I'd like that corrected." Bones looked at him for a moment. "Good," she said simply. "Come on." The hearing chamber was smaller than the main Wizengamot chamber, a side room, used for individual cases, with a tiered seating arrangement that held perhaps 25 members and a witness area at the center. It was already nearly full when they arrived. Every seat occupied. The gallery above, smaller, barely a gallery, more of a mezzanine, packed with journalists and ministry staff and people who had not gotten seats through official channels but had gotten in anyway, because this was the morning everyone understood they needed to be part of. Harry sat in the interested party section, which was a row of chairs to the left of the witness area that was normally used for victims' families and estate representatives. He put his documents case on his knee and looked at the chamber and thought about his parents sitting in a house in Godric's Hollow not knowing what was coming, and thought about a man on a motorcycle delivering a baby to a doorstep in Surrey while something had already broken in him, and found he was holding the documents case rather tightly and loosened his grip. Marchbanks was presiding again. She came in at 5 to 10 with the same compressed, authoritative energy she'd had on Monday, sat in the presiding chair, and looked around the room with the expression of someone about to conduct an orchestra. Bones was at the prosecution table, though technically this wasn't a prosecution, it was a review, the distinction mattering somewhat, with two of her senior DMLE staff. On the defense side, a solicitor Harry hadn't met, Millicent Bagnall's former junior, a sharp-faced woman named Cassandra Fawcett who had built her career on wrongful conviction cases and who was holding a stack of documents with the patient intensity of someone about to play their best hand. The chamber went quiet. Marchbanks said, formally, "This session is convened for the emergency review of the incarceration order issued November 3, 1981, for Sirius Orion Black. Mr. Black will be present via," she looked at the clerk. "Secure transport, ma'am. He's in the anteroom. Bring him in." The door to the anteroom opened. Harry had formed some kind of mental image of Sirius Black, had tried to keep his expectations calibrated, but the mind does what it does, and what his mind had done was compile an impression from the newspaper photograph he'd seen and the descriptions in the Prophet and the fact that Sirius Black had been his parents' closest friend and his father's brother in all but blood, and none of that had quite prepared him. He was thin in the way of someone who had been thinner and was only now beginning to recover from it, prison thin, the kind that shows in the neck and wrists and the quality of skin. He moved well, though. Better than Harry expected. He walked into the room with the particular carriage of someone who has spent 10 years refusing to let a place take everything. His robes were clean, someone in the ministry had managed that much, and his dark eyes moved around the chamber rapidly, assessing, and then found the interested party section. Found Harry. They looked at each other across the chamber, and something passed between them in that moment that was too complicated for Harry to name right away. He was looking at someone he'd never met who was looking back at him with 10 years of waiting and grief and cold fury and something else underneath all of that, something almost unbearably careful, and Harry held the look steadily and gave a small nod, and Sirius Black closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, and then opened them and sat down in the witness chair with the composure of someone who intends to get through the next hour without losing it entirely. Fawcett patted his arm once, briefly, and opened her case. The hearing moved fast, which was Amelia Bones's doing and everyone in the room knew it. She presented the evidence without embellishment, the missing will, confirmed by Gringotts, the 1981 guardianship hearing transcript, showing Dumbledore's testimony and the 11-minute determination, the confirmed loyalty compulsion on 3 of the 7 witnesses present at Black's original incarceration order. She presented the Gringotts evidentiary statement, the DMLE's own overnight review of the case file, and the 3 pages of the case file that turned out to be not missing but misfiled, in the same archival category as James Potter's secondary will, under the same obscure 25-year seal. Those 3 pages were the arrest report from November 1, 1981, written by the Auror first on scene. The report noted, in the careful language of official documentation, that Peter Pettigrew had been the secret keeper for the Potters. Not Sirius Black. The Auror had interviewed 2 witnesses who confirmed it. The report had been filed, sealed, and lost in the archive within 48 hours, 3 days before the incarceration order was signed. The chamber heard this in silence. The silence had a texture to it, not the silence of shock but the silence of pieces falling into an arrangement that everyone could see and nobody wanted to say first. Marchbanks said, "Who signed the archival seal on the arrest report?" Bones looked at the document. She set it down. "The filing was processed through the Chief Warlock's office," she said. "No individual signature on the seal. The office stamp only." The texture of the silence changed. Fawcett stood. I would like to enter into record that my client was never informed of this arrest report, never given access to this material, and was incarcerated on an emergency order that the presence of this document should have, prevented. I am further entering into record that my client has no prior convictions, was not tried by jury or by full Wizengamot session, and has been held under Dementor custody for 10 years on the strength of a process that was, at minimum, fatally incomplete. She paused. I am asking for full and immediate exoneration. Marchbanks looked at Bones. The DMLE does not oppose the exoneration, Bones said. We support it. From the Wizengamot seats, the murmur was immediate. 7 members wanted the floor at once. Marchbanks let them speak in sequence, brisk and uninterrupted, and the consensus was rapid in the way that consensus is sometimes rapid when the facts are so clear that arguing with them feels less like a position and more like a personality defect. 2 members raised procedural concerns. Both were addressed. One member, Algernon Croker, a cautious man who had been on the Wizengamot for 30 years and prided himself on never rushing anything, said quietly, if there's reason to believe the evidence was actively suppressed, the exoneration should be recorded as such. Not just incomplete process. Active suppression. He looked at the archive seal document on the table when he said it. He didn't say anything else. Marchbanks called the vote at 10:47. 23 in favor of full exoneration. 2 abstentions. 0 opposed. Sirius Black sat in the witness chair while Marchbanks read the formal exoneration ruling, and he held himself very still in the way of someone who has spent a long time deciding in advance not to fall apart. His solicitor put her hand on his arm again, briefly. He didn't move. When Marchbanks finished and looked at him, he said, in a voice that was rough in a way that had nothing to do with physical condition, "Can I?" He stopped. Started again. "I'd like to speak to Harry." Marchbanks looked at Harry. Harry was already standing up. They met in the middle of the chamber floor, which was probably not the protocol, but nobody stopped them, and stood facing each other in the specific way of people meeting for the first time who already know each other's entire history from one direction and none of it from the other. Harry looked up at him. Sirius looked down. And Harry saw something in Sirius's face that he recognized instinctively, the expression of someone who is looking at something they almost lost and are still not sure they've fully got back, and felt his throat do something complicated. "You look like James," Sirius said. Then, "Sorry." It's fine," Harry said. "People say that. You've got Lily's eyes though." He said it quietly. "She'd have," he stopped. "Are you all right? Are you?" He seemed to become aware that he was asking questions with 10 years of urgency behind them at a rate that the situation didn't quite support, and he pressed his lips together and said, "Sorry. I keep starting sentences I don't." "I know," Harry said. "No, I have so much." "I know," Harry said again. More firmly. He held Sirius's gaze. "We have time." Sirius Black looked at him for a long moment, and something in his face, the careful 10-year composure he'd walked in wearing, came down a fraction. Just a fraction. But it was visible, and it meant something. "Yeah," he said, in a different voice. "Yeah, we do." "There's a house," Harry said. "In Marylebone. It was my parents'. I opened it up." He held out the key he'd had in his coat pocket all morning. The one he'd left on the entry table and retrieved last night because it seemed wrong to leave it there with nobody in the house. "It's yours if you want it. Temporarily. Until you." Sirius stared at the key for a moment. Then he took it. He wrapped his hand around it like it was something fragile, and he held it, and Harry looked at his face and looked away, because some expressions are private even when they happen in public. "Thank you," Sirius said, and his voice was rough in a different way now. "Thank Gringotts," Harry said. "They did most of it." Sirius almost laughed. It wasn't quite there yet, the laugh he'd had before Azkaban, the one that had apparently once cleared whole corridors, but it was approaching, the way spring approaches winter. The outline of it. Of course they did, he said. Mercenary bastards. Effective though, Harry said. Very. Sirius closed his hand around the key. He looked at Harry with the expression settling into something more sustainable, less at risk of coming apart. I want to know everything. About your life, what you've been doing, what, he stopped himself. Later. Right? Later, Harry agreed. The main Wizengamot chamber convened at 2 in the afternoon for what the notices had listed as Continued Emergency Extraordinary Session, matter of APWB Dumbledore, and the queue for gallery seats had started at 9 in the morning. By 1 o'clock it stretched down the corridor and around the corner, and by the time the chamber opened it included 3 former ministers, a delegation from the French ministry who had gotten wind of proceedings through the ICW, and Arabella Figg from Privet Drive who had taken 2 buses to get here and was in the gallery queue with her cat-hair-covered coat and a copy of The Prophet and an expression of someone who has been waiting to say I told them for approximately a decade. Harry was in the chamber proper this time. Not the gallery. He had his Wizengamot seat. This had caused a certain amount of procedural scrambling, because a Potter Lordship seat hadn't been occupied in 10 years and the seat itself had been physically removed from the tiered arrangement at some point, not destroyed, just placed in storage, which said something about someone's level of confidence that it would never be reclaimed. It had been retrieved and placed that morning with a slightly new wood quality to its position among the older seats, conspicuous in its newness, and when Harry sat down in it at 1:45, there was a specific quality of attention from the chamber that he absorbed without acknowledging. Sirius had wanted to come. Harry had said not yet, and Sirius had started to argue and then had looked at Harry's face and stopped and said, "You've thought about this," with some surprise, and Harry had said, "I've thought about most of it," and Sirius had sat back with the expression of someone recalibrating. He was at the Marylebone house. He had Fawcett on standby. He had a Gringotts document in his pocket that confirmed his cleared status and his role as magical guardian, and Harry had told him he'd come back after the session, and Sirius had looked at the key in his hand and said okay. Now Harry sat in his seat, his by right, empty for 10 years, and looked at the chamber filling around him and thought about Ragnok saying you are not the last to know anything anymore and felt, more precisely than he had before, what that meant. Marchbanks came in at 2 o'clock exactly. Bones at her table, reorganized now with a thicker case and 2 additional DMLE officers. The Wizengamot filing around the tiers, all 47 again, every seat occupied. The gallery above at standing capacity. Fudge in his minister's chair looking like a man who'd swallowed something and was trying to look as though he hadn't. And in the witness well, already seated when the session opened, in the same traveling clothes he'd worn on Monday because he'd apparently declined the offered change of clothing during his 2 days in ministry custody, Albus Dumbledore. He looked, if anything, more present than Monday. Not more comfortable, but more settled. The way some people, when the worst has already happened, stop bracing for it and become strangely still. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes moving around the chamber with the attention of someone who is reading every face, and when those eyes found Harry's seat they stopped for a long moment. Dumbledore looked at Harry. Harry looked back. It was a strange experience, Harry thought, to look at someone you'd never met but who had made most of the significant decisions about your life. He'd expected to feel angrier. The anger was there, it hadn't gone anywhere, but it was under something else now, something more complex and less useful as a guide. Because Dumbledore sitting in the witness well looked like a person. An old, tired person who had made choices so large and so wrong that they'd collapsed onto him, and he was sitting in the middle of the collapse and not flinching from it, and Harry found that less satisfying than he'd anticipated. He was going to have to think about Dumbledore for a long time. That was clear. But not today. He looked away first. Marchbanks called the session to order. Bones presented the full case in one continuous piece, which took 40 minutes and which she delivered with the contained, technical precision of someone who has built something extremely solid and knows it. She presented the scan results, certified and sealed. She presented the 3 bindings in detail, expert testimony from Healer Whitmore on the loyalty compulsion, supplementary statements from 2 additional magical law specialists on the core restriction and the perception alteration. She presented the will evidence, the archive suppression, the guardianship hearing record. She did not editorialize. She did not explain what it meant. She presented the facts and let the chamber sit in them. When she finished, Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore. "Mr. Dumbledore. You've heard the evidence as presented. Would you like to respond?" He stood. He was, as he always had been, the most commanding presence in any room he occupied. Whatever Azkaban had not done to Sirius Black, custody had not done to Dumbledore. He was not diminished, not apologetic, not a man who had lost his grip on himself. He was simply, precisely, someone who was going to tell the truth after a very long time of not quite doing so. "I did everything I have been accused of," he said. The chamber absorbed this. It was becoming, Harry thought, a habit for the man. The one-word admission expanded slightly, the same essential quality. Not a confession designed to reduce consequences. A statement of fact. "I placed the bindings on Harry Potter on the 1st of November, 1981, Dumbledore continued. "I placed them because I had received a prophecy the previous year that named a child as the only person capable of defeating Lord Voldemort, and I had determined that the child needed to survive to fulfill that role, and that survival required management of the circumstances of his upbringing." He paused. "I decided that a child of 11 with full access to 4 Wizengamot lordships, an unrestricted magical core, and considerable public visibility was more likely to be destroyed by those advantages than by their absence. I believed that I was protecting him." "You believed you were the appropriate person to make that decision," Bones said. "It wasn't quite a question." "I believed I was the only person positioned to make it correctly," Dumbledore said, and said it without particular shame, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with some. "I had information no one else had. I had perspective that came from 60 years of involvement in the larger conflict. I acted on it." "You suppressed evidence in a murder case," Marchbanks said. "The arrest report." A pause. "I determined that Sirius Black's incarceration was necessary for Harry's safety. He was innocent. I believed," Dumbledore said, and his voice went a fraction quieter, "that an innocent man in Azkaban caused less damage to the larger situation than a free man whose grief and anger and tendency toward recklessness might." He stopped. Something crossed his face. "I was wrong," he said. "About Sirius. I was wrong about several specific things, and I have known it for some time, and I did not take action to correct them because taking action would have required dismantling arrangements I still believed necessary." "You thought you were the only one who could see the whole board," said a Wizengamot member from the second tier, not hostile, almost wondering. "So you kept moving the pieces." Dumbledore looked at him. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "That's exactly what I thought." The chamber sat with it. Marcus Greengrass, who had been one of the first to ask for evidence on Monday, said, "I want to understand one thing clearly. The loyalty compulsion. The 12 names. Were any of them compelled toward you personally, or toward a particular judgment?" "They were compelled toward a general disposition of trust in my leadership and judgment," Dumbledore said. "Not specifically toward any individual decision. The compulsion was broad spectrum. But the effect was that people in Harry's immediate world, and in the governing body around him, were less likely to question my management of his situation." He looked at his folded hands. "Yes." Harry watched him say it and thought about Hagrid, who was somewhere, probably Hogwarts, reading the Prophet and having to figure out what parts of his enormous, genuine warmth were entirely his own and what parts had been given a nudge. He felt the anger again, sharp and clear, and also something adjacent to it that wasn't sympathy exactly. More like recognition. The recognition of someone who understands what it looks like when a person believes so completely in their own necessity that they stop being able to see the cost. He thought, I don't ever want to be that. He thought, that's probably the most important thing I've learned this week. Bones stood. She looked at the chamber. I am presenting 3 formal charges, she said. Unauthorized magical interference with a protected minor, carrying a sentence of 5 to 10 years. Suppression of material evidence in a criminal proceeding, carrying a sentence of 2 to 7 years. And unlawful manipulation of Wizengamot proceedings through magical compulsion of voting members, carrying a sentence of 7 to 15 years. She laid the charge sheets on the table. These are not concurrent, they are cumulative. Total potential sentence of 14 to 32 years. The chamber noise rose sharply. Dumbledore had gone very still. Marchbanks raised her hand and the noise settled. The charges are tabled. Debate will proceed. I want to note, she looked around the room with an expression that contained decades of watching very intelligent people make very avoidable mistakes. I want to note that the severity of these charges does not preclude consideration of context, intent, or mitigating factors. This chamber will give full weight to the fact that the defendant has cooperated fully, confessed voluntarily, and presents no risk of flight. She paused. It will also give full weight to the fact that an innocent man spent 10 years in Azkaban, a child was illegally bound and isolated for 10 years, and the governance of this body was interfered with for a decade. Another pause. Both of those things are true at the same time. That is the challenge before us. The debate lasted 2 hours. Harry sat in his seat and listened to 47 people wrestle with something genuinely difficult, and it was, despite everything, despite his personal stake in it, despite the anger that kept surfacing when he heard specific details repeated, genuinely difficult. Nobody defended what Dumbledore had done. Not even the people who liked him, and some of them clearly still did, carrying the years of genuine good alongside the specific terrible wrongs. What they debated was the weight. The severity. Whether the man in the witness well was a monster or a fallible person who had made choices of enormous consequence from a position of unchecked power, and whether those two things were mutually exclusive. A woman named Augusta Longbottom spoke for 15 minutes about the nature of institutional trust and the specific damage done when the most trusted person in an institution is also the one who has broken it. Algernon Croker spoke about the evidence suppression with a cold precision that stripped away context entirely and left only the plain fact of an innocent man and a sealed report. Someone Harry didn't know gave a speech about Dumbledore's role in the last war that was moving and accurate and also, Harry thought, slightly beside the point, because doing good things didn't retroactively undo the bad ones. Dumbledore sat through all of it. He didn't look at his feet or at the ceiling or anywhere that would suggest he was managing his own discomfort. He looked at each speaker. He listened. It had the quality of penance, not performed penance, not the strategic submission of someone calculating their best angle, but the actual thing, the willingness to be witnessed fully. Harry watched him and didn't look away. When the debate finished, Marchbanks said, "Is the defendant prepared to enter a formal plea?" Dumbledore stood. "Guilty on all 3 charges," he said. "I ask only that the chamber consider, in sentencing, the degree to which I can be of use. Not to reduce my sentence. To continue to contribute to the resolution of the larger situation." He looked at the chamber. "Voldemort is not gone. He will return. I have information and capability that will be needed, and I am aware that my offering this is," he paused. "Ironic, given that the premise of my management of Harry's life was that only I had the necessary information. I understand the irony. But the information still exists." "We'll take that under advisement," Marchbanks said, and the dryness of it brought the first and only moment of something like reluctant amusement to the chamber. "The formal sentencing hearing will be scheduled within 14 days. Until then, Mr. Dumbledore will remain under ministry supervision. Not Azkaban, supervised house arrest at a location determined by the DMLE." She looked at Bones. "Agreed?" Bones nodded. "Good." Marchbanks looked at the chamber. Are there any immediate motions before we close? Harry stood. He hadn't entirely planned to. He'd planned to watch and listen and take everything back to Sirius and sit with it. But he was on his feet before the deliberation finished, and 47 Wizengamot members and a packed gallery turned to look at him, and Marchbanks looked at him with the alert attention of someone who is genuinely curious. "Mr. Potter," she said. "The chair recognizes the Lord Potter." The title was strange in the air. Heavy. His. "I have one motion," Harry said. His voice was steady. He'd discovered in the past week that when things mattered enough, his voice went steady the way his hands did during the ritual, not because he forced it, but because the thing that was actually him, underneath everything that had been done to him, was steadier than the circumstances. "I want to formally request that the Wizengamot commission a full review of all legislation passed in the past decade by margins of fewer than 10 votes, in light of the suppressed lordship seats and the documented compulsion of voting members." He paused. Not to repeal everything. To review it properly. With all the seats occupied. By people who are choosing freely. The chamber was very quiet. Marchbanks looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the empty seat that had been in storage for 10 years, now occupied by its rightful holder, slightly new against the worn wood of the others. "Motion tabled," she said. "Vote will be taken at the next full session." She looked around the room. "Is there anything else?" There wasn't. Dumbledore was escorted out by 2 DMLE officers at 4:53 in the afternoon. He passed near the interested party section on his way to the door, and for a moment, just a moment, he and Harry were close enough to speak without the chamber hearing. Dumbledore stopped. Harry looked at him. "I'm sorry, Harry," Dumbledore said. Not with the elaborate, careful architecture of his usual speech. Just the words, plain. "For all of it. But most for this, I should have trusted the people who loved you to protect you. I should never have believed I was the only one who could." Harry held his gaze. He thought about the key in Sirius's hand. About Petunia making breakfast. About Ragnok's old gold eyes saying you are a client of Gringotts Bank with more genuine respect in it than he'd received in 11 years of being the boy who lived. "Yeah," Harry said. "You should have." He paused. "But you're going to have time to think about it." Dumbledore looked at him for another moment, and something in his expression shifted, not to hope, not quite, but to something in that vicinity. He nodded once and walked on, and the DMLE officers closed the chamber door behind him. Harry sat back down in his seat. The chamber around him was breaking into the noise of a large group of people simultaneously trying to process something that would take weeks to fully absorb. Up in the gallery, the journalists were already moving. Somewhere in the crowd, Arabella Figg was probably trying to find the exit. Harry looked at the new wood quality of his chair among the older seats, and at the empty seats around him, the Black Lordship seat, still unclaimed, pending Sirius's situation resolving, the Peveril and Gryffindor lines, their complications still working through the Gringotts system. He thought, this is going to take a long time. He thought, good. He picked up his documents case, stood up, straightened his coat, and walked out of the Wizengamot chamber for the first time as the Lord Potter, and behind him the chamber kept going, and the world kept rearranging, and the afternoon was almost over. He had somewhere to be. Chapter 5, Shockwave. The first thing Sirius Black did in the Marylebone townhouse was stand in the kitchen for 20 minutes. Not doing anything. Not unpacking, not making tea, not exploring the house he'd been told was clean and ready and his for however long he needed. Just standing at the kitchen window with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the small walled garden outside where autumn was doing its quiet work on the ivy, and breathing the particular air of a house that had belonged to James and Lily Potter and hadn't been breathed by anyone in a decade. Harry found him there when he arrived at 6:15 and let himself in through the front door. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, reading the room, and then went to the kettle and filled it without saying anything. Sirius turned from the window. Good session? Charges laid. Guilty plea. Sentencing in 14 days. Harry set the kettle on the hob. Marchbanks approved supervised house arrest pending sentencing. Not Azkaban. Not Azkaban. Sirius nodded slowly. He pulled a chair out from the kitchen table and sat down in it with the careful movements of someone who is still learning that furniture will hold them. And your motion? Tabled for the next full session. Bones thinks it'll pass. Harry leaned against the counter and looked at him. How are you? It was a simple question and Sirius took it seriously. He sat with it for a moment, his hands flat on the table. Strange, he said. Everything's. He looked around the kitchen. Do you know what it's like to have touch back? After a long time? The Dementors don't exactly, they don't take your senses, not literally, but everything goes cold and flat, and it's like, he stopped. Sorry. You don't need, I'm asking, Harry said. Sirius looked at him. Right. He exhaled. Strange. Good strange, mostly. But the world keeps being more solid than I expect it to be. He looked at his hands. Your father's kitchen, he said, quietly. The kettle began to heat. Harry found mugs, 2 of them, in a cabinet above the counter, plain white with that slight dust on the inside quality of cups that haven't been used in years. He rinsed them and set them out. I need to ask you something, Harry said. Ask. The prophecy. Dumbledore mentioned it in the session. He said he received one the year before I was born. He turned to look at Sirius directly. Did you know about it? Sirius's expression didn't quite close, but it became careful. James and Lily knew, he said. They didn't tell me everything. There were things about the Order's intelligence structure that Dumbledore compartmentalized. He paused. I knew it was serious. I knew they were specific targets, not just because of their blood status or their involvement in the Order. But the details, he shook his head. No. I didn't know the exact shape of it. Harry nodded. He poured hot water over the tea bags. I'm going to need to find out, he said. All of it. The prophecy, what it says, what it means. Dumbledore knows, and now, he stopped, thinking. Now he's under supervision. So I need to find another way. Sirius watched him. He had the expression Harry was beginning to recognize, something between assessment and something more personal, the face of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation he thought he knew. How long have you been planning this way? He asked. Like this. Systematically. Harry thought about it. Since Saturday morning, he said. When I read the scan for the first time. For days, Sirius said. Is that? James thought like that, Sirius said. Fast and sideways. Like the problem was a chessboard and he could already see 3 moves ahead. A pause, and something complicated moved in his voice. You look like him, but you sound more like Lily. She was the one who made the plans work. Harry set a mug in front of him. He sat down at the table. He held his own mug and thought about 2 people he'd never known, assembled now from fragments, Petunia's locked-away grief, Sirius's careful love, Ragnok's documents, Dumbledore's chessboard management of their legacy, and felt the familiar strange ache of loving people you've never met. Tell me about them, he said. While we drink this. Sirius Black wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at the table, and then he started talking, and for the next 2 hours the kitchen was warm and the ivy moved in the garden outside and Harry listened to his parents become real. The shockwave from Monday's arrest and Thursday's hearing had been moving outward all week in the specific way of significant events, not in one clean expanding ring but in dozens of smaller ripples intersecting, amplifying, canceling each other out in some places and building into something enormous in others. On Friday morning, 3 things happened simultaneously. The Daily Prophet ran a front page that Rita Skeeter had apparently written in a single overnight session fueled by what Harry chose to imagine was coffee and professional ferocity. The headline read, "The Decade of Managed Truth, How One Man Shaped Wizarding Britain, and What Comes Now." It was 6,000 words, meticulously sourced, and it did something the earlier coverage hadn't quite done: it connected the dots from the specific to the structural. Not just what Dumbledore had done to Harry, but what the climate of managed trust had done to the wizarding world's ability to question its own institutions. It was, Harry thought when he read it at breakfast, the kind of journalism that made things happen rather than just describing things that had. The second thing was a letter from Hogwarts. It arrived by owl, the usual Hogwarts post, the tawny kind, carrying the familiar cream-and parchment of a school letter with the seal still intact. Harry opened it expecting something about his enrollment status, given that Hogwarts's headmaster was currently under house arrest and half the governing board was in the middle of a constitutional crisis. Instead it was from Minerva McGonagall. "Dear Mr. Potter, I have been deputy headmistress of Hogwarts for 18 years and I have, during that time, deferred on a great many matters to the judgment of Albus Dumbledore. Some of those deferrals I stand by. Others I am reviewing in light of recent events, as I expect you would agree I should. I am writing to you directly, not through any ministry channel or Gringotts intermediary, because I believe that the pattern of people communicating about you rather than to you has gone on long enough. Your place at Hogwarts remains yours. School begins on the 1st of September. I am the acting headmistress pending resolution of the current situation, and I want you to know that my door is open and that when you arrive, you will find the castle substantially unchanged from what your parents knew. There is one further matter, which I mention because I think you deserve to hear it from me directly rather than in a newspaper. I am on the list of 12. I received the DMLE notification this morning. I want you to know that I have been asking myself all week which parts of my regard for Dumbledore's judgment were mine and which were augmented, and I don't have a complete answer. What I do have is the knowledge that my concern for your welfare, now that I am applying it without that pressure, feels cleaner and more urgent than it did before. Make of that what you will. I look forward to meeting you in September. Yours, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, Acting. Harry read it twice. He put it down. He thought about the phrase cleaner and more urgent and felt something in him, some small, tightly held thing, ease slightly. He wrote back the same morning. One paragraph. He said he was looking forward to September and that he appreciated her writing directly, and that he thought cleaner was probably the most honest word anyone on the list had used yet, and that he had no interest in holding things against people who were now looking at them without the pressure on. He asked about the defense against the dark arts position because the prophet had mentioned it was currently vacant and he was curious whether that was related to current events or to a pattern he'd also read about in the coverage. He signed it, Harry Potter. McGonagall's reply arrived 3 hours later and was, in its entirety, 2 sentences. The defense position has been difficult to fill for 4 years and the reasons are complicated. We will discuss it when you arrive. He liked her immediately. The third thing that happened on Friday morning was Hermione Granger. He hadn't known about Hermione Granger. She hadn't been in the newspaper, she wasn't on any list, she had no connection to the Gringotts disclosure or the Wizengamot or any of the institutional machinery that had been running since Saturday. She was a girl with bushy brown hair and very direct eyes who knocked on the front door of the Marylebone townhouse at 10:30 in the morning while Sirius was upstairs trying to sleep off 10 years of Azkaban and Harry was at the kitchen table with his documents. He opened the door. She was standing on the step with a copy of the Daily Prophet under her arm and a leather satchel over her shoulder and an expression that was carefully composed over something that was, Harry thought, approximately 70% anxiety and 30% determination. "You're Harry Potter," she said. "Yes," he said. "I'm Hermione Granger. I've been accepted to Hogwarts for September." She held up the newspaper, which was the Thursday edition, the one with his Wizengamot session on the front page. "I read all of this. The whole week of it. Every edition." "Okay," Harry said. "I'm Muggle-born," she said. "Both my parents are dentists. Neither of them has any magical background at all. And when I read about the loyalty compulsion and the perception alteration, I thought. She stopped. She seemed to be making a decision. I thought, who's been checking on us? The Muggle-born students, the ones who get letters out of nowhere telling us about this whole world, who's been making sure that information is complete and accurate and isn't managed the same way Harry Potter's information was managed? Harry looked at her. I don't think anyone has, she said. I've been reading. There's almost no literature about Muggle-born integration that isn't 20 years old and written by purebloods. The Hogwarts letter is a single sheet of parchment with a list. There's no context, no history, nothing about how the wizarding world actually works or what the power structures are or any of it. She took a breath. I spent 4 months reading everything I could find. I found quite a lot, but there are gaps everywhere, and some of the gaps look like the same kind of gaps that were in Harry Potter's situation, which is to say they look like they might be deliberate. Harry said, "How did you find this house?" "Gringotts," she said, without embarrassment. "I went to the bank. I introduced myself and explained my concern and asked if there was anyone I should be talking to. The goblin I spoke to, Mr. Ragnok, said I had good instincts and gave me this address." Harry thought about that. He thought about Ragnok, who had struck him as a goblin who did nothing without calculation, which meant Ragnok had decided this was a conversation worth having. He thought about the 30% determination he'd assessed in Hermione Granger's expression and revised it upward. He stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. "I'll put the kettle on." Hermione Granger sat at the kitchen table and produced, from the leather satchel, a system of organized notes that Harry found simultaneously impressive and slightly alarming, and she talked for 45 minutes with the focused clarity of someone who has been thinking about something for months and is only now finding an audience that won't write it off. She'd identified 6 structural gaps in Muggle-born integration that she thought warranted investigation. She'd identified 3 pieces of existing legislation that appeared, based on her reading of the legislative record that the Prophet had been publishing all week, to potentially disadvantage Muggle-born students before they'd even completed their first year. She'd identified an absence of any formal representation for Muggle-born wizards in the Wizengamot that she found concerning and had done the arithmetic on how long it had been absent and what decisions had been made in that absence. She was, Harry thought, doing exactly what he'd been doing, reading everything, finding the gaps, following the logic. She was just 11 and had been at it for months and had better organizational habits. "You're going to Hogwarts in September," he said, when she finished. "Yes. So am I." "I know," she said. "I thought, if we were going to be dealing with all this anyway, it might be useful to not be dealing with it separately." She looked at him with the directness that was apparently her default setting. "Is that presumptuous?" Harry thought about the week he'd had. About sitting alone in Gringotts on Saturday and alone through the ritual on Tuesday and, Sirius notwithstanding, alone in the Wizengamot chamber among 47 adults who were all better equipped for the situation than he was, except that he was the one with the seat and the documents and the focused anger and the new resonance in his chest. "No," he said. "It's sensible." She smiled. It transformed her face somewhat, less the expression of someone presenting an argument, more the expression of someone who had just found something they'd been looking for. "Good," she said. "Because I've also been thinking about your magical core restriction and what the educational implications are, and I have some questions about the reversal ritual if you're willing to discuss it." Before Harry could answer, there was a sound on the stairs, the careful, slightly disoriented sound of someone navigating a house they're still not entirely sure is real, and Sirius appeared in the kitchen doorway in old robes with his hair at considerable angles and an expression of someone who had been attempting sleep and had achieved only its general outline. He looked at Hermione. She looked at him. "Sirius Black," he said. "Hermione Granger," she said. "She's 11, Harry said. "She's going to Hogwarts. She's been doing independent research into structural gaps in Muggle-born integration." Sirius looked at the organized notes on the kitchen table. He looked at Harry. He looked at Hermione again, and something moved in his face that was the first genuinely uncomplicated thing Harry had seen in it. James and Lily would have loved you, he said, to Harry. I was talking about her, Harry said. I know, Sirius said. I was too. He moved to the counter and looked at the kettle. Is there more of this? I slept 4 hours total, I need approximately a gallon of tea, and I want to hear about the structural gaps. Friday afternoon brought Ron Weasley, which was less organized than Hermione's arrival and considerably more complicated. He showed up at the front door at 2 o'clock with a note from his mother that he'd clearly been told to hand over and a personal expression that had nothing to do with the note. He was tall for 11, broad-shouldered, with red hair and a generous face that was currently doing the specific work of someone carrying something heavy and trying to look like he wasn't. Mum wrote, he said, handing Harry the note somewhat stiffly. She wanted to explain about the compulsion. And say sorry. Harry read Molly Weasley's letter. It was long, full-page, both sides, the writing pressing hard into the parchment in places, and it said, among other things, that she was horrified, and that she'd been sitting with the DMLE notification all week trying to work out what was and wasn't hers, and that she was fairly sure the warmth she felt toward Harry was real because she'd felt it when she'd looked at photographs of Lily before she'd ever met Harry, but that she couldn't be completely certain about the trust she'd placed in Dumbledore's management of Harry's life, and she was sorry she hadn't questioned it harder. It ended by saying the family hoped Harry would visit when he was ready and not before. It was, Harry thought, almost as honest as Petunia's "I don't know, Harry," which meant Molly Weasley had managed the most honest thing she could in an impossible situation. She didn't have to apologize, Harry said. She didn't do anything wrong. She knows that, Ron said. She's apologizing anyway because that's what she does. He looked at the pavement. She cried. Most of the week. He said it flatly, like a fact, but it cost him something to say it. Dad was quieter. Which is worse, actually. When Dad goes quiet. Harry stepped back from the door. Come in. Ron came in with the slightly careful movement of someone who is in an unfamiliar house and doesn't want to break anything. He stopped in the hall and looked around. Is this, my family's house? Potter Town House. Harry said it without ceremony. There's tea, if you want it. Yeah, all right, Ron said. In the kitchen, he found Hermione, who was still at the table with her notes, and Sirius, who was on his second gallon of tea and reading the Prophet with the focused absorption of a man catching up on a decade of news. He looked up when Ron came in. Ron stopped and looked at him with the expression of someone who has known about a person their whole life via family stories and is recalibrating. You're right, Ron said, which Harry took to mean he'd heard the stories and was confirming something about reality matching expectation. Sirius Black, Sirius said. Ron Weasley, Ron said. He looked at Hermione. Who are you? Hermione Granger. I'm going to Hogwarts in September. So am I. He sat down, not at the organized notes end of the table, which suggested better spatial awareness than Harry might have expected. He looked at Harry. How are you doing? Actually? It was such a straightforward, unqualified question, no calculation in it, no agenda, that Harry felt something loosen slightly that he hadn't noticed was tight. Honestly, he said, sitting down. I'm managing it. It's a lot. Yeah. Ron nodded. He looked at the table. My brothers won't shut up about it. Fred and George keep saying it's brilliant, which, he stopped. It's not brilliant, is it? It's complicated. It is, Harry agreed. But some of it is also sort of, Ron looked at him sideways. Brilliant, Harry finished. Well, Ron said, and a grin moved across his face despite what looked like his best efforts to contain it. A bit. Hermione looked between them with the expression of someone watching a dynamic establish itself and deciding where to position herself in it. I've been telling Harry, she said, that we need to approach September strategically. If there are ongoing structural issues in how Hogwarts operates, and given everything that's come out this week, I think there almost certainly are. We should be prepared to identify and address them from day one. Ron looked at her. On day one, he said. Or close to it. Right. He looked at Harry. Is she always like this? I've known her for 4 hours, Harry said. But yes, I think so. Brilliant, Ron said, and this time he meant it completely, even if he wasn't entirely sure in what direction. Amelia Bones came to the Marylebone house on Saturday morning, which was unexpected and announced only by a brief owl the evening before that said she had matters to discuss with both Harry Potter and Sirius Black and would they be available at 9. She came alone, without her DMLE escort, in plain robes, carrying a briefcase and the air of someone who has been running at full capacity for a week and has organized her exhaustion into a manageable block. Harry let her in. Sirius was up, he was sleeping in proper stretches now, 4 and 5 hours at a time, and the color was coming back slowly, and he looked at Amelia Bones across the kitchen with the expression of a man who owes someone something enormous and hasn't figured out how to say it yet. Thank you, he said. For Thursday. The evidence thanked you, Bones said, with the same precision she'd used to Harry. I filed the paperwork. She sat down and opened her briefcase. I have several things. First, Sirius, your formal exoneration documentation. Certified, sealed, registered with the Wizengamot and the ICW. She laid it on the table. Your name has been removed from the criminal register. Your properties, accounts, and assets are being restored under Gringotts management. Bonecrush has been coordinating. Your full legal status is restored. Sirius picked up the document. He held it with both hands. He read it carefully, the whole thing, every word, even though it was essentially legal formatting around 2 straightforward sentences. Harry watched him do it and said nothing. Second thing, Bones continued. Harry. The DMLE has completed its initial review of your situation. Formally, you are currently under what the legal code calls temporary self-wardship, because you are a minor with no active guardian. Your Gringotts client status and your Wizengamot seat together constitute a recognized independent legal identity, which is unusual for an 11-year-old but not unprecedented. She paused. I want to flag that this status is temporary and needs to be resolved properly before September. A formal guardianship needs to be established. Sirius, Harry said immediately. Bones looked at him, then at Sirius. That will require a formal Wizengamot application, given the circumstances. It's not complicated, the will already names him, the exoneration clears the obstacle, but it needs to go through proper channels. Fawcett can handle it, and I'll expedite from the DMLE side. She paused. There's one complication. What? Sirius said. Dumbledore's sentencing, she said. He's agreed to give full testimony about the situation, including the prophecy, including everything he knows about Voldemort's current status and likely trajectory. The sentencing hearing is in 13 days. But there are people on the Wizengamot who want his knowledge on record before they determine his sentence, on the basis that it's material to an ongoing threat. She looked at Harry. The prophecy concerns you directly. You have a right to be present when it's disclosed. Harry sat with that. He thought about Dumbledore in the witness while saying Voldemort is not gone. He will return. He thought about a prophecy made before he was born, that had shaped every decision about his life, that he still didn't know the full text of. I want to be there, he said. I thought you would. She closed her briefcase. One more thing. The legislation review motion, your motion, from Thursday. She looked at him steadily. It's going to pass at the next session. But I want to flag that when it passes, the review process will be complex and contested, and some of the people pushing hardest for it will not be doing so in your interest. There are factions that want to use the review to repeal protections, not just restore them. The Death Eater sympathizer block has been very quiet this week. She said it without particular alarm, just as a fact, which means they're waiting for something. When the review starts, they'll move. What kind of move? Sirius asked. I don't know yet, Bones said. But Voldemort's network doesn't go away because Dumbledore's management of the opposition to it has been disrupted. If anything, she paused. If anything, removing the person who's been the primary force organizing against him creates a gap. That gap needs to be filled by something legitimate before something less legitimate fills it. Harry looked at Sirius. Sirius looked at Harry. Something passed between them, the compressed communication of people who have been thinking about the same thing from different angles. What do you need from us? Harry asked. From you, right now, nothing, Bones said. Be 11. Go to Hogwarts. Let the legal processes run. The Wizengamot is not broken, it's been compromised, and we're correcting it, and it will do its work. She stood. From you, she looked at Sirius, I'd like you to consider whether you're willing to give testimony in the Dumbledore sentencing hearing. About the 1981 incarceration. The chamber needs to hear it from you directly. Sirius looked at his exoneration document. At the formal language describing something that should never have happened. Yes, he said. I'll testify. She nodded. She picked up her briefcase. At the kitchen door she stopped and looked back at the two of them, the man who'd been wrongfully imprisoned for 10 years and the boy who'd been managed for 11, and she had an expression that was not quite warmth and not quite professionalism but somewhere between them, the face of someone doing the right thing in a situation that was nobody's version of good. For what it's worth, she said, the work you both did this week, coming in, speaking, filing the motions, all of it, made every part of this faster. The institutions work better when the people in them have reasons to work properly. She paused. That sounds bureaucratic. I mean it as a compliment. I know you do, Harry said. She left. Sirius sat at the table for a moment. He looked at the exoneration document. He set it flat on the table and smoothed the edges with his thumb, carefully, the way you'd handle something important. Then he looked at Harry. You're going to be all right, he said. Not a question. Not entirely a statement either. More like something he was deciding out loud. I know, Harry said. I mean it. He stopped. James and Lily would be, another stop. He pushed the document aside slightly. I'm sorry I wasn't there, he said. For the first part. I should have, you were in Azkaban, Harry said. I know, but, Sirius. Harry waited until he was looking at him properly. You were in Azkaban. That's not on you. The quiet that followed had the quality of something being put down. Right, Sirius said, after a moment. Right. On Sunday, Hagrid came. There was no letter, no prior notice. Just an enormous knock on the front door at noon that Harry felt through the floor, and when he opened it, Hagrid was on the step, all 9 feet and wild beard and eyes that had been crying very recently and were doing their best to look like they hadn't been. Harry stared up at him. Hagrid stared down at Harry. Yeah, look just like your dad, Hagrid said, and his voice broke almost immediately on the last word, and he pressed his enormous hand over his mouth, and Harry made a rapid decision. Come in, he said. Mind your head. Hagrid minded his head. He didn't fit entirely comfortably in the kitchen, he took up most of one wall, but he accepted the largest mug Harry could find and sat on the floor, which turned out to be both more stable and more practical than any available chair, and he held the mug in his lap and looked at Harry with the expression of a man who had been reading about himself in the newspaper all week and was arriving at the end of something very difficult. I got the DMLE notice, he said. Thursday. About the compulsion. I know, Harry said. And I've been trying to work out, I always, he stopped. He started again. I care about you. Ya understand? I haven't even met ya properly yet and I care about ya already, and I don't know how much of that's. It doesn't matter, Harry said. Hagrid looked at him sharply. Wha? I mean, Harry thought about how to say it. The compulsion affected your relationship with Dumbledore. Not with me. You don't know me well enough yet for anything about me to have been nudged. Whatever you feel when you look at me is yours. He paused. Probably partly because I look like my dad. Hagrid made a sound that was between a laugh and a sob. Yeah, do, he said. Yeah, really do. He looked at his mug. I'm angry, he said, like it was a confession. At Dumbledore. And I don't want to be angry at him because he stopped. But what he did to you. What he let happen. Yeah, we're in a cupboard, Harry. Yes, Harry said. And I didn't, he pressed his free hand over his face. I never questioned it. I thought, Dumbledore knows best, it'll all work out, and I never, Hagrid, Harry said, and waited. Hagrid lowered his hand. Did you have any reason to know where I was or what my life was like? Well, no, but, then you couldn't have questioned it. Nobody gave you the information to question. I could have asked. Could you? Harry said, gently. Against the compulsion? A long silence. Hagrid looked at the kitchen floor. I dunno, he said finally. I genuinely dunno, and that's the worst part. Harry nodded. Yeah, he said. I think that's the worst part for everyone on that list. They sat together for a while after that, and Hagrid told him about his parents, different stories from Sirius's, the perspective of someone who had known them as extraordinary students and then as extraordinary adults, who had carried them in his memory with the particular weight that Hagrid carried everything, which was completely and without reservation. He told Harry about a motorbike ride in the rain and a baby that had fallen asleep on his shoulder and hadn't woken up even when they'd landed, and Harry listened and felt the pieces of his parents settling further into something solid. You're going to Hogwarts, Hagrid said, with some of the cloud lifting from his expression. 1st of September, Harry confirmed. Good. Hagrid's eyes went bright again, but differently this time. I'll be there. Groundskeeper. I've been there since, he stopped. Since Dumbledore gave you the job, Harry said, and kept his voice even. After the thing with the Chamber of Secrets, when you were expelled. Hagrid looked at him. Yeah, read above that. The Gringotts documents reference it, Harry said. There's a notation about a Hagrid, in Dumbledore's administrative actions in 1943. I read everything in the file. He paused. He did that right. Getting you the job. Hagrid was very still for a moment. Then he said, he did a lot right, he said. And a lot wrong. And I'm gonna have to figure out how to hold both those things. He looked at Harry with the honesty that was the most purely Hagrid thing about him, the absolute inability to pretend. Same as you are, I expect. Same as everyone is, Harry agreed. Monday morning. 1 week since the raven at the kitchen window. Harry sat on the windowsill of the Marylebone townhouse's front room, looking out at the street in the early light. He had the week's full stack of daily profits beside him, and his Gringotts documents, and McGonagall's letter, and a new notebook he'd bought from a corner shop because the habit of recording things had established itself and he wanted somewhere to put them. He was writing a list. Not of problems, he had too many of those and they were already organized, but of things that were better than they'd been 7 days ago. He had a name that was his. Harrison James Potter. He'd been writing it at the top of things all week just to see it there. He had a house. 2 houses, technically, this one and the vault and the one at Hogwarts and the ones pending and the one in Godric's Hollow that he wasn't ready for yet. He had his magical core, unrestricted, still learning what to do with it, the resonance settling into something familiar and enormous. He had a godfather asleep upstairs, 2 weeks out of Azkaban, getting his color back in 4-hour increments. He had a Wizengamot seat, new wood against old, with 3 more possibly coming. He had Hermione Granger's organized notes and Ron Weasley's straightforward loyalty and Hagrid's enormous, uncomplicated love and Amelia Bones's integrity and McGonagall's directness. He had the Gringotts disclosure, 63 pages, still working its way through the wizarding world in dozens of intersecting ripples. And out there, he looked at the last line of the Daily Prophet Sunday edition, the one Skeeter had buried in the final paragraph of a long analysis piece, almost as a footnote, the thing she'd noted carefully and without alarm: 3 Death Eater families have retained new legal counsel this week. Sources in the DMLE confirm no charges have yet been brought, but investigations are active. And out there, something that was not yet moving but was watching. Waiting for the right moment in the gap. He wrote in his notebook, "The gap needs to be filled by something legitimate before something less legitimate fills it." Amelia Bones's words. He underlined it. He thought about Dumbledore saying Voldemort is not gone. He will return. He thought about a prophecy he didn't know the full text of, shaping his life from the outside like the binding on his core, a force applied before he could choose it, by someone who believed the choice was too important to leave to him. He was going to hear that prophecy. He was going to understand exactly what he was dealing with. And then he was going to decide, himself, freely, with no compulsion and no management and no one moving pieces on his behalf without his knowledge, what he was going to do about it. He added one more item to his list. Voldemort. He looked at it for a moment. He didn't add anything else. The street outside was coming awake. Someone walked a dog past the front gate. A bus went by at the far end of the road. Ordinary Sunday, ordinary city, the entirely indifferent world going about its business around a boy on a windowsill who was writing things in a notebook and figuring out the shape of what came next. Upstairs, he heard Sirius moving. The particular careful sounds of someone learning again what it felt like to move through a house that was theirs. Harry closed the notebook. He put it in his coat pocket. He got up and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. Outside, down the invisible street, 3 Death Eater families had new solicitors and were watching carefully. The gap was there. Harry Potter was aware of it, and had a plan, and was 11 years old, and had the particular quality of someone who is only just getting started. Chapter 6, The boy who chose the Wizengamot sentencing chamber felt different from the other rooms Harry had been in this month. The main chamber had the weight of institution, all that dark wood and accumulated authority, the sense of processes that had been running for centuries and would keep running regardless of what any individual person did. The hearing room for Sirius had been compressed, urgent, moving fast. But this room, smaller still, more rectangular, lit by windows along one wall that let in actual daylight rather than the usual ministry torchlight, felt almost intimate. Almost being the operative word, because there were 43 people in it. Marchbanks at the presiding chair. Bones at her table with her team. 26 Wizengamot members selected for the sentencing committee. Ministry observers, legal attaches, 2 representatives from the ICW who had arrived the day before and were sitting with the careful attention of people who are watching something they expect to need to report on. Sirius beside Harry in the interested party section, wearing robes Fawcett had organized that almost fit and looking like he hadn't slept much, which was accurate. And in the witness well, Albus Dumbledore. He looked the same as he had 10 days ago. Perhaps slightly more rested. House arrest, Harry had heard, was at a location with proper beds and a library, and Dumbledore had apparently been using both. He sat straight and he looked at the room clearly, and he looked at Harry for a moment before Harry looked away. Harry had spent the past 10 days thinking about Dumbledore. Not obsessively, there had been too much else happening for obsession, but the way you think about something you need to understand before you can put it down. He'd read everything. The full session transcript from the arrest. Skeeter's long analysis. A piece in which weekly of all places, written by someone Harry didn't know but clearly did know what they were talking about, that traced the specific philosophy behind Dumbledore's decisions, the utilitarian logic that had justified each individual choice by the weight of the larger outcome it was meant to serve. He understood it now. He didn't agree with it. But he understood it, which was different, and the difference mattered. Marchbanks opened the session at 10 o'clock. This sentencing hearing concerns 3 charges to which the defendant has entered guilty pleas: unauthorized magical interference with a protected minor, suppression of material evidence in a criminal proceeding, and unlawful manipulation of Wizengamot proceedings. The purpose of today's session is threefold. First, to receive the defendant's full testimony regarding material information pertinent to ongoing magical threats. Second, to receive the testimony of affected parties. Third, to determine sentencing. She looked at the room. We will proceed in that order. Dumbledore's testimony took 90 minutes. He gave it the way he gave everything, Harry thought, with the full weight of a mind that had been working on these questions for decades: no hedging, no self-protection. He described Voldemort's rise comprehensively, the philosophy, the network, the specific magical capabilities that made him unlike any dark wizard before him. He described the Horcrux theory, which produced a silence in the room so complete that Harry could hear the windows settling in their frames. He explained what a Horcrux was with the clinical precision of someone who has had a long time to prepare for the worst conversation of his life. He was describing the fragmentation of a soul. The deliberate, violent act of splitting one's consciousness across multiple anchors so that death became, in the absence of destroying all the anchors, impossible. How many? Marchbanks asked, with the stillness of someone absorbing something large. I believe 7 was his intention, Dumbledore said. I have confirmed the existence of 6. The 7th was unintentional and is. He looked at Harry. He had been not looking at Harry throughout the testimony with the focused deliberateness of someone who knows they are going to have to look eventually. Complicated. The room looked at Harry. Harry looked at Dumbledore. Say it, he said. Dumbledore held his gaze. On the night of October 31st, 1981, when the killing curse rebounded from Harry and struck Voldemort, the rebound was caused by Lily Potter's sacrificial protection. The magic involved was ancient, extremely powerful, and essentially catastrophic in its energy release. In that release, a fragment of Voldemort's soul, already destabilized by the process of creating the other Horcruxes, latched onto the only living thing in the room. He paused. Harry. The silence had a different quality now. You're telling me, Harry said, carefully, that I'm a Horcrux. An unintentional one. And importantly, unlike the others, which were deliberately created, which required specific acts of magic to embed the soul fragment, yours was accidental. The rules that govern the destruction of deliberate Horcruxes do not fully apply. He looked at Harry steadily. I have spent 10 years researching this. I believe, I am nearly certain, that there is a method by which the soul fragment can be removed without harming you. But it requires your willing participation and it requires the ritual to be performed correctly. Nearly certain, Sirius said, from beside Harry, and his voice had a specific edge to it. It's the best I have, Dumbledore said, and the admission had no performance in it. Just the plain shape of a man saying what he knew and what he didn't. Harry sat very still. He thought about the resonance in his chest since the core restriction was removed, the new window feeling of his own magic. He thought about whether what he felt as himself was entirely himself, and then he thought that this was not a useful direction to think in right now, in this room, with 43 people watching him. We'll deal with that later, he said, and his voice was steady. What are the Horcruxes? All of them. Names, locations, everything you know. Dumbledore told him. All of it. He gave the chamber a complete account: Tom Riddle's diary, already destroyed; Marvolo Gaunt's ring, location known; Slytherin's locket, last known location; Hufflepuff's cup, a currently unknown object he believed to be from Ravenclaw; Nagini the snake, and Harry himself. He gave them everything he'd confirmed and everything he suspected, with the careful designation of which was which. Bones was writing continuously. Her team was writing. The ICW representatives were writing. The room had the quality of something being set in stone, information that had lived in one man's head for years being distributed into the world, becoming common property, becoming something that other people could work with. Harry watched Dumbledore talk and thought, this is what it looks like when the information stops being managed. It wasn't clean. It was frightening and complicated and deeply unfinished. But it was real, and it was out there, and 25 people in this room could now think about it and work on it instead of one. The affected party testimony was supposed to be brief. Bones had explained the format. Each person on the list of those directly affected could give a brief statement if they wished. There was no obligation. The statement would inform the committee's sentencing consideration. Sirius went first. He stood at the witness position and he spoke for 8 minutes. He described the arrest, the hearing that wasn't, the Dementors and 10 years in a cell on the strength of a process that had been deliberately compromised. He described it without particular anger and without performance, in the flat, factual tone of someone who has already done the emotional work privately and is now here for the public record. When he finished, he said, I am not asking for a severe sentence. I'm asking for an honest accounting. Those aren't the same thing. He sat down. 3 members of the Wizengamot had the expressions of people trying not to visibly react to something that has visibly affected them. Marchbanks was looking at her notes with an expression that Harry recognized as her version of the same thing. Then Marchbanks said, Lord Potter. Do you wish to give a statement? Harry had been thinking about this for 3 days. He stood. He looked at the room, the 43 people in it, the presiding chair, the witness well where Dumbledore sat, the windows letting in grey October light. He looked at Sirius, who gave him a small nod. He looked at the committee. Then he looked at Dumbledore directly, and he held it, and he said what he'd been figuring out how to say. I'm 11, he said. I've been making decisions since I was 11 days old that I only found out about 11 days ago, which means I've been living in the results of those decisions my whole life without knowing they were decisions at all. I thought I was just unlucky. I thought the way things were was the way things were. He paused. The last 2 weeks have been the first time in my life that I've known the actual shape of my own situation. And I want to say something about that, for the record, before anything about sentencing. The room was entirely still. I don't think Albus Dumbledore is a monster, Harry said. I think he's a person who was given an enormous amount of power and not enough people to answer to. And I think the decisions he made, about me, about Sirius, about the compulsions, came from a genuine belief that he was the only person who could see the whole picture clearly enough to act on it. I think that belief was wrong. Not because he was stupid or cruel, but because nobody should have that much unchecked authority over other people's lives, regardless of how smart they are or how much they know. He looked at the committee. That's the actual problem. Not one bad man. One unchecked position. And the answer to it is the review I tabled last week, and the proper occupancy of Wizengamot seats, and the removal of compulsions, and every other structural correction that makes it harder for one person to manage everyone else's choices without their knowledge. He looked at Dumbledore again. Dumbledore was looking back at him with the expression Harry had been trying to name all morning, and he named it now. It was the expression of someone encountering something they underestimated. As for the sentence, Harry said, I want him to work on the Horcrux problem. Under supervision, properly overseen, with full disclosure at every stage. Not because I'm forgiving him, I'm still working on that and I don't think I owe him a timeline, but because the information in his head is more useful out in the world than locked away in a cell. He paused. And because I think the people who deserve the most consideration in the sentencing aren't me. They're the 12 people on the compulsion list who are still working out what was theirs, and Sirius, who lost 10 years. He sat down. The room held the silence for several seconds. Sirius, beside him, was very still. Then he put his hand briefly on Harry's shoulder, one quick contact, immediate, completely genuine, and removed it. The committee deliberated for 90 minutes. Harry and Sirius went to a waiting room down the corridor, which had chairs and a window and a tray of ministry biscuits that were slightly stale. Hermione was there. She'd come with Ron, who was sitting with his long legs stretched out looking at the ceiling. She'd been in the gallery for the testimony session and had her notebook out. "The Horcrux information," she said, to Harry, the moment he came in. "I know," he said. "We need to think about the research approach. If Dumbledore has already done 10 years of work on the problem, there'll be a methodology we can build from, but he'll have had confirmation biases and gaps based on what he was choosing to look at in Hermione," Harry said. "What? Can we have 20 minutes first?" She looked at him. She looked at his face. "Oh," she said, and closed her notebook. "Yes. Of course." She looked slightly mortified, which Harry thought was unnecessary. "You're going to be very useful," he told her. "Later." "Right," she said, slightly pink. Ron looked at Harry from his ceiling-watching position. "You all right?" "Yeah." Harry sat down. He looked at the stale biscuits. He took one. He thought about a soul fragment living in his scar for 10 years, and the strange thing about it was that it didn't feel like news, exactly. It felt more like the last piece of a puzzle fitting into a place you'd left empty so long you'd stop noticing the shape. "Yeah, I'm all right." "The Horcrux thing is terrifying," Ron said. "Yes," Harry said. "But you've got people working on it now. Instead of just one old man." "Yes. So that's better." "Considerably," Harry said. Ron nodded. He went back to looking at the ceiling. "Good biscuit?" he said. "Terrible," Harry said. "Right," Ron said. "I'll have one." The committee returned at 2:15. Marchbanks read the determination in the same clear, unornamented way she did everything. On the charge of unauthorized magical interference with a protected minor, 3 years suspended sentence, contingent on the conditions set out below. On the charge of suppression of material evidence in a criminal proceeding, 2 years custodial, suspended pending conditions. On the charge of unlawful manipulation of Wizengamot proceedings, 5 years suspended, conditions as below. She looked at Dumbledore. "No custodial sentence will be served provided the following conditions are maintained: full cooperation with the DMLE's ongoing investigation into remaining Death Eater network activity. Full cooperation with the Wizengamot's Independent Research Committee on the Horcrux problem, to be established within 30 days. Mandatory magical monitoring for a period of 7 years. Permanent removal from the position of Chief Warlock with no future eligibility. Continued house arrest for a period of 6 months, reviewed quarterly." And, she looked at the parchment, then at Harry. "One additional condition, proposed by the committee and accepted by the defendant." Harry looked at her. "Annual disclosure," Marchbanks said. "Every year, on the 31st of July, Harrison Potter's birthday, Albus Dumbledore will provide a full and complete accounting of any information he holds relevant to the Horcrux problem, the Voldemort situation, or Harry Potter's magical inheritance, to be shared with Harry Potter directly, with no filtering, no management, and no conditions." The chamber was quiet. Harry looked at Dumbledore, and Dumbledore looked at Harry. "Do you accept these conditions?" Marchbanks asked. "I accept them," Dumbledore said. Outside the sentencing chamber, in the corridor while the administrative machinery processed the determination, Dumbledore stopped beside Harry. The DMLE escort gave them a foot of space, which was the minimum courtesy and also the maximum they were comfortable with. Sirius was 3 feet back, watching. "I had a great deal of time to think," Dumbledore said, while in custody. "I want to tell you something." Harry waited. "The prophecy does not compel you," Dumbledore said. "I always presented it, even in my own mind, as though it were a fixed requirement. A burden that could not be refused. That was," he stopped. "That framing served my purposes, because it made the management of your life feel necessary. Essential. As though removing my management would leave you unprotected from a fate already written." He looked at Harry directly. The prophecy says that you have the power to defeat him. It says that one of you must kill the other. It says nothing about how, or when, or whether you chose it. The choice was always yours. I convinced myself that taking it from you was protecting you from the weight of it. Harry held the look. He was thinking about 15 months old and 3 bindings and a cupboard and 11 years of not knowing his own shape. He was thinking about Sirius on a cell floor with a newspaper. He was thinking about 12 people trying to figure out which feelings were theirs. It's still mine, Harry said. The choice. Yes, Dumbledore said. It always was. Then we're clear, Harry said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to forgiveness. But it was a line, precisely drawn, and Dumbledore seemed to understand it as such, because he nodded once and didn't push further, and the DMLE officers moved him along down the corridor. Sirius fell into step beside Harry. You all right? Same question as Ron, same words, completely different weight. I think so, Harry said. I need to think. You've been thinking for 2 weeks straight, Sirius said. I know. I'm good at it. James was too, Sirius said. It drove Lily insane. She'd tell him at some point you just have to stop thinking and do something. Harry looked at him. What did he do? Usually something stupid and dramatic that somehow worked, Sirius said. Ended with someone either laughing or concussed, 50-50. Harry almost laughed. Almost. I'll try to aim for the laughing version. Aim for it, Sirius said. Can't guarantee it. Potter men historically, don't say it. I was going to say historically adaptable. You were not. Historically, Sirius caught the look on Harry's face and grinned, and it was the real one, the one that was coming back in increments, the echo of something that had apparently once cleared whole corridors. All right. Historically lucky when they shouldn't be. That, Harry said, I'll take. November came in cold and clear. Harry spent October in the Marylebone house with Sirius, doing the reading Hermione sent him, which was considerable, and working with a ministry-assigned magical tutor on basic spell theory, because it turned out that going into Hogwarts with an unrestricted magical core and no formal training was an interesting combination that the tutor, a patient man named Fletcher, described as like trying to learn to drive a very fast car in a car park, theoretically fine, practically hair-raising. He learned quickly. Faster than Fletcher's notes suggested he expected, which Harry absorbed with the private thought that 10 years of compression releasing all at once had produced a kind of pent-up readiness. Like a spring. He was careful with it. The guardianship application went through on October 17th. Fawcett had been as good as Bones's word, efficient, precise, the paperwork expedited, and Sirius became Harry's legal magical guardian on a Thursday afternoon in the same courthouse where the exoneration had been filed, in a ceremony that was technically brief and legally complete and felt, in the way of things that become real before you're entirely ready for them, enormous. Harry signed his name on the document. Sirius signed his. Fawcett countersigned as witness. In the car park outside, it was a ministry side entrance, a building in Whitehall, raining. Sirius looked at the sky for a long moment with his signed copy in his hand. He pressed his lips together. He looked at Harry. I promised James, he said. At the wedding. I told him, he was being an idiot about something, I can't even remember what now, and I said, whatever happens, I'll look after them. Lily rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic, and James said he was counting on it. He folded the document. He put it in his coat. 10 years late. You're here now, Harry said. Yes, Sirius said. I am. He exhaled. Right. He looked at Harry. "'Ju want to go get lunch? Real food, not ministry biscuits." "Yes," Harry said. "Absolutely yes." They went and got lunch in a small Italian place 3 streets over, and Sirius ordered pasta that he ate with the single-minded devotion of someone reacquainting himself with the concept of food that tasted like anything, and Harry ate his own and told him about the tutor sessions and the reading Hermione was sending, and Sirius asked questions and gave opinions and laughed twice, properly, the full version. It was, Harry thought, the most ordinary afternoon he'd had in his life. He found he liked it enormously. The legislation review began in October and was exactly as complex and contested as Bones had warned. Harry attended 3 sessions as Lord Potter, sitting in his seat with the documents Hermione had prepared. She'd sent a 12-page briefing for each session, which arrived by owl the morning before, color-coded by priority, and watching the factions maneuver. The Death Eater sympathizer block moved on the second session, as Bones had predicted, proposing language in the review terms that would have allowed existing blood status protections to be re-examined under a new framework that sounded neutral and wasn't. Augusta Longbottom caught it in the first reading and said so clearly. Harry seconded the point from his seat, citing the specific clause and the precedent it set. The language was removed. 3 sessions in, Marcus Greengrass said to Harry during a recess, with the careful assessment of a man who is updating his understanding of a situation, "You've been preparing." "I have some help," Harry said. "More than some," Greengrass said, and there was respect in it rather than criticism. "Your briefings are better than half the official committee documents." "I'll tell Hermione," Harry said. "The Granger girl? Muggleborn?" "Yes." Greengrass nodded slowly. "Bring her to the next public session," he said. "I want to see her work in person before I decide what I think about the Muggleborn representation proposal." Harry sent the owl that evening. Hermione's reply arrived at 6 in the morning the next day and contained the words "Tell him to be prepared for a full briefing on legislative gaps from 1985 onwards and nothing else." He forwarded it to Greengrass with the note, "You've been warned." The Horcrux Research Committee assembled in late October with 6 members, 2 unspeakables, a curse-breaking specialist from Gringotts, which was Ragnok's contribution, delivered with the air of a man calling in a favor while appearing to offer one, a healing specialist from St. Mungo's, Dumbledore under his monitoring conditions, and a 7th spot that the committee had left open, which Marchbanks had described during the committee formation session as pending determination of the most appropriate expertise. The committee's first meeting was at the Department of Mysteries. Harry was not in the room. He was 11, and whatever choices he was making, he wasn't going to pretend that put him in the room with unspeakables, but he received the summary, which was part of the annual disclosure condition, applicable immediately. The summary said, 1 Horcrux confirmed destroyed. 5 remaining plus 1 anomalous case, see separate analysis. Initial methodology established. Timeline for full resolution, minimum 2 years, likely 5 to 7. Anomalous case assessment, soul fragment present and stable. Removal methodology theoretically viable. Assessment of risk, manageable, not negligible. Participant decision required before proceeding. Harry read participant decision required and thought about Dumbledore saying the choice was always yours. He filed the summary. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he wrote to Bonecrush and asked whether there was any goblin ritualist experience with soul fragment removal. Bonecrush's reply was 3 sentences, yes. 2 precedent cases, both pre-accord. Both successful. We will need your decision in writing before any further discussion. Harry wrote yes on a separate sheet and enclosed it. He'd made the decision. The work would take time. That was fine. He had time, more of it now, properly his own, than he'd had in 11 years. On October 31st, Harry went to Godric's Hollow. Sirius drove. He'd gotten a license in 1979 and hadn't quite unlearned it, though Muggle driving appeared to occupy a space in his muscle memory adjacent to flying rather than similar to it, which made the journey interesting. Harry sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees and watched the countryside go flat and then roll and then go flat again, and didn't say much, and Sirius didn't either. He'd decided he needed to see it before Hogwarts. Before September became a new chapter, and this one closed into something he'd look back on rather than something he was in the middle of. He needed to stand in front of it and let it be the thing that it was. The village was small and ordinary in the way of English villages, the kind that had a pub and a post office and a church and had looked approximately like itself for 200 years. The Fidelius charm was long broken. Gringotts had maintained the land, as Ragnok had said, and the local Muggle population had retained their own understanding of the house at the end of the lane through various low-level charms that were now also lapsed, which meant the house was simply there. Standing partly destroyed and partly intact, with 10-year-old ivy growing over the damaged walls and the garden gone to seed around it, under a grey October sky. Harry stood at the gate. He'd prepared himself for it to be devastating, and it was, undeniably, but it was also something else. It was the most real place he'd ever stood. More real than Gringotts, more real than the Wizengamot, more real than the kitchen in Privet Drive or the new wood smell of the Marylebone house. This was where it had happened. This was the specific ground on which everything that had followed had pivoted. Sirius stood beside him without speaking for a long time. A small headstone was in the church graveyard. Ragnok had told him. He hadn't gone to look, not today, maybe not yet. But the house was enough. They were happy here, Sirius said, eventually. I know it was during the worst time, and they were hiding, and it was frightening. But I visited twice before. He stopped. Lily had the kitchen full of plants she was experimenting with, and James had borrowed every book from the wizarding library in the next village over and was trying to relearn ancient runes for some reason neither of them would explain, and you were, he looked at Harry. You were a very opinionated baby. Apparently. Had opinions about everything. Very loud about them. Harry looked at the house. I should get it repaired, he said. You don't have to, Sirius said. I know. I want to. He looked at the wall where the damage was worst, the upper story that had taken the brunt of whatever had happened that night. Not to live in. It shouldn't stay like this. It should be, he thought about it. It should be itself. Whatever it was when they were here. Yeah, Sirius said softly. Yeah, I think so too. They stood there a bit longer. The grey sky held itself steady. Somewhere in the village, someone was burning garden waste. The smell drifted over the lane, sharp and seasonal, entirely indifferent to what the lane had seen. Harry felt, standing there, the full weight of everything that connected him to this place. The prophecy, the night, the rebound, the fragment, the 10 years, the week that had changed everything. He felt it fully, without the binding, without the perception alteration nudging him toward smallness, without anyone managing the distance between him and the reality of his own life. It was heavy. It was absolutely his. He turned away from the gate. He walked back toward the car. Sirius walked beside him. Hogwarts in 10 months, Harry said. And you'll be insufferably prepared, Sirius said. I'll be appropriately prepared, Harry said. Hermione's word for those is the same, Sirius said, and Harry made a sound that was unmistakably a laugh, and the lane received it and the grey sky was indifferent to it, and it happened anyway, and that was the thing about choosing, it happened anyway, in the small moments as much as the large ones, in the laugh on the lane outside the house that needed repairing, with the godfather who was getting his color back and the scar that was also a problem he was going to solve and the Wizengamot seat with the new wood smell and the long work ahead. It happened because he was choosing it. September the 1st arrived on a Tuesday. Harry had been ready for 3 days. Sirius had insisted on packing 2 days before and then spent an entire day reorganizing the trunk, which Harry had let him do because it was clearly less about the packing and more about Sirius needing to do something with the anxiety of the day, and because the result was genuinely more organized than Harry's original version. Platform 9 3/4 was exactly as chaotic as he'd been told to expect, which was to say it was 100 families simultaneously doing the same thing in the same space with varying levels of success, and it smelled of engine smoke and autumn and something faintly magical underneath both of those, and the Hogwarts Express sat along the platform in red and gold with a quality of impatient readiness, and Harry stood at the barrier for a moment before going through and just looked at it. He found Hermione almost immediately. She was at the train with her parents, who were slightly dazed in the specific way of Muggle parents at platform 9 3/4, and she was reassuring them with the patience of someone who has been reassuring anxious people about magic for 4 months and has developed good technique. She saw Harry and her face did the thing it did when she was relieved to find something she'd been quietly unsure about. "You're here," she said. "I'm here," Harry agreed. "Your trunk's organized?" Sirius reorganized it. "Good," she said, as though this was the natural order of things. She turned to her parents. "This is Harry Potter. He's the one I've been working with." Her parents shook Harry's hand with the combined expression of people who have heard a great deal about someone and are recalibrating all of it simultaneously against the person in front of them. Her mother said, "It's lovely to meet you," with genuine warmth and the slightly careful tone of someone who has been reading the Daily Prophet archives and has questions they're being very restrained about. "You too," Harry said. "She's been incredibly helpful. The briefings especially." Hermione's mother looked at Hermione with the expression of someone whose prior understanding of their child's organizational habits has just been independently confirmed. Ron appeared from the crowd like a large, red-headed force of nature, with his mother and 5 other Weasleys at various states of attachment behind him. Molly Weasley stopped when she saw Harry and had the expression for a moment of someone who has been composing something to say for weeks and finds that the actual moment has made all the composites inadequate. "Harry," she said. "I'm very glad to meet you." "You too, Mrs. Weasley," Harry said. He meant it. She looked at him. She looked at him with the particular quality of attention that the compulsion removal had left her with, cleaner and more urgent, McGonagall had said, and then she did something that surprised him. She didn't apologize again. She didn't make it about the compulsion or the list or any of the things she'd been processing. She just said, "Are you ready for this?" "Yes," Harry said. "Good," she said. "Then go on." He went on. Sirius was on the platform for approximately 4 minutes longer than strictly necessary, which Harry noted and said nothing about, because the sight of Sirius Black on platform 9 3/4 watching his godson board the Hogwarts Express was, by any measure, the kind of moment that had been 10 years and 1 week in the making and deserved whatever time it needed. Harry stopped at the train door and looked back. Sirius was standing at the barrier. He had his hands in his coat pockets and he was doing the thing he did when he was trying to look casual, which he was not entirely good at yet, and his hair was still slightly at angles, and he looked like a man who was doing the single hardest thing of his day, which was letting go of something he'd only just gotten back. Harry held up a hand. Sirius held up a hand back. Then Harry got on the train. He found a compartment. Hermione was already in one, saving seats with the practiced authority of someone who had thought about this, Ron piling in behind Harry with a chocolate frog already open, and he put his trunk in the rack and sat by the window and watched the platform through the glass as the train began to move. He watched Sirius until the platform slid away. Sirius watched back. Then the train rounded the bend and the platform was gone and ahead was the English countryside and then Scotland and then Hogwarts. Harry leaned back against the seat. "You all right?" Ron said, through the chocolate frog. "Yes," Harry said. "It's going to be brilliant," Ron said, with the certainty of someone who has been told this by 5 older siblings and has decided to believe all of them. "It's going to be complicated," Hermione said, from behind her reading. "Both," Harry said. Outside, the countryside opened up, fields and hedgerows and occasional towns receding into something wilder as they went north. Harry watched it go past and thought about the year ahead and all the years after it, and felt the weight of all of it, the Horcruxes and the prophecy and the legislation review and the Death Eater families watching for the gap and the soul fragment in his scar that was going to need addressing and the 4 lordship seats and Dumbledore under supervision and Voldemort not gone and all the work, all of it, still undone. He felt it fully. He held it. And then he made the choice he'd been making, in small ways, for the past 3 weeks, the choice to be present in the moment he was actually in rather than the one he was braced for. He reached into his bag and pulled out the chocolate frog box Ron had thrown to him. He opened it. The card inside was Dumbledore. He looked at it for a moment. Then he flipped it over and read the card. Albus Dumbledore, currently serving a suspended sentence under Wizengamot supervision, considered by many to be the most talented wizard of the modern age. Are you serious? Harry said. What? Ron leaned over. He saw the card. He burst out laughing, properly, loudly, the Weasley version of laughter which committed completely. You got Dumbledore. First card, Harry said. Hermione looked up from her book. She looked at the card. She pressed her lips together very firmly. That is, she said, with the careful enunciation of someone managing their own expression, a remarkable coincidence. Harry looked at the card. He turned it over. He thought about Albus Dumbledore sitting in house arrest with his monitoring bracelet and his library and his annual disclosure obligation and his chocolate frog card featuring an updated entry, and he thought about the year that had passed in one extraordinary week, and he thought about choices and who got to make them. Then he flicked the card out the window. Ron laughed harder. Hermione made a sound that she would later insist was not a laugh but absolutely was. The Hogwarts Express kept going north, carrying 3 11-year-olds and 1,000 other things, through the autumn countryside, under a clear sky, toward whatever came next. Harry Potter looked out the window at the moving world and felt, for the first time in his life, exactly like himself. The work wasn't done. It had barely started. Voldemort was still out there in some form, patient and not quite gone, and the Horcruxes numbered 5+1 anomalous case, and the legislation review would take years, and the Death Eater network was reorganizing in the silence left by Dumbledore's fall, and there was a soul fragment in Harry's scar that needed dealing with, and the wizarding world was in the middle of the most significant political upheaval since the end of the last war. But Harry Potter was going to Hogwarts with his magical core his own and his name his own and his choices his own, with a godfather on a platform watching him go and 2 people in a train compartment who were his by their own free election, and he knew the shape of the problem, and he had people around him who knew it too, and he had a Wizengamot seat and Gringotts in his corner and the resonance of his own magic telling him consistently and clearly that he was more than the sum of what had been done to him. The gap was there. He was going to fill it. He'd already started.